The broadcast of the regular meeting of the Public Health and Safety Committee will now begin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the regularly scheduled meeting of the Public Health and Safety Committee for November 19th, 2020. My name is Cunningham, and I am the chair of this committee. As we begin, I will note for the record that this meeting has remote participation by members of the City Council and City staff as authorized under Minnesota Statutes Section 13D.021 due to the declared public health emergency. At this time, I will ask the clerk to call the roll so we can verify a quorum for this meeting.
Councilmember Gordon?
Here.
Cano? Here. Ellison?
Present.
Palmisano?
Present.
Fletcher?
Here.
Chair Cunningham?
Present.
There are 6 members present.
Thank you, and let the record reflect that we have a quorum. Colleagues, today we will begin with our public hearing on item number 1, which is on the agenda, to consider the executive committee's appointment of Brian Tyner to the appointed position of fire chief. So I will check here to see. So we have currently great. We do have Mayor Fry on the line. So before we open up the public hearing, I will pass over the floor to Mayor Fry to be able to speak to this item. Welcome, Mayor Fry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Proud to be here today to move forward this nomination of our now Assistant Chief and hopefully our future Chief, Brian Tyner, to the position of the Fire Chief of the City of Minneapolis. It goes without saying, but the position of Fire Chief is a critical one for our city, especially during times of great difficulty. And I'm so proud to have someone that has rose up through the ranks of our exceptional department. We have so many wonderful firefighters in MFD, and Chief Tyner has occupied pretty much every single position that you can possibly have. He's a son of the North Side. He's served the city of Minneapolis for 25 years, steadily working his way through the ranks. And so many of you are already familiar with Assistant Chief Tyner's commitment to the city fire department. And he's shown this great commitment to growing diversity within the ranks. And that diversity is playing out now. I mean, we're seeing the recruit classes that come in, the new firefighters that are ultimately part of our department are increasingly diverse. And something that you might not know about Assistant Chief Tyner is his commitment to the community outside of City Hall. He's a Special Olympics basketball coach. He's a youth mentor with the Den Brothers and Junior Achievement. And I know he'll lead this department and protect our city with great integrity and the kind of spirit that you would expect out of someone who grew up right here in Minneapolis. And so with that, I'd like to thank AC Tyner for your willingness to serve, both in the past as well as the future. And also a really huge thank you to Chief Friedel, who has undoubtedly helped to educate and prepare Chief Tyner for this very day. So thank you to both. Your service is greatly appreciated, and thank you, Mr. Chair and council colleagues. I do ask for your support.
Thank you, Mayor. Much appreciated to have you here today to be able to speak your words of support. So now I will move into opening the public hearing. We have a good amount of folks here to speak to this item, so very grateful for folks taking the time to do so. So what I will go ahead and do is I will go down the list. I will name who is up, and then the 2 following folks, so folks are prepared. When it is your time to talk, you're going to push *6. then you wait a moment to hear a recording, and then the floor is yours. So again, make sure you push *6. Just hold a quick moment. You'll hear a recording that says you are unmuted, and then the floor is yours to be able to speak. And give me one moment here. So with that, I will first call on Joseph Madison, followed by Brian Tyner, with Barbara Johnson on deck. So Joseph Madison, are you on the line? Please push *6.
Yep, I'm on the, I'm sorry.
No worries. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Cunningham. I've been calling in to support Brian Tyner for Minneapolis Fire Chief. Brian and I are both were hired on the same hiring list back in 1994, and I've known Brian this whole time within the fire department in the many roles that he has played in protecting the city. Brian is someone that I really can trust to make the right decisions for our residents of Minneapolis and for the members of Minneapolis Firefighters Local 82. I'm proud that Brian's getting this opportunity, and I'm very happy that Chief Mayor Fry nominated Brian for this position. And I fully support him, and I hope he gets confirmed by your committee. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Madison, for being here. It's wonderful to have your voice in this conversation. All right, next up we have Brian Tyner, followed by Barbara Johnson, with James Thomas on deck. Mr. Tyner, are you on the line?
I am.
All right, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Committee Chair and members of the committee, for giving me this opportunity to speak with you today. I want to let you know right away that I'm very excited about the opportunity to possibly be what I believe is only the 18th fire chief in the history of the Minneapolis Fire Department. My personal values are honesty, integrity, and fairness. And those are the values that I plan to bring with me during my tenure as chief. Those are the values that I plan to instill in the Minneapolis Fire Department during my tenure as chief, and those will be the expectations that I will have for the members of the Minneapolis Fire Department. I'd like to take an opportunity to thank Chief Friedel for his leadership and for leaving this department in such a great place. I believe I'm going to have the opportunity to take over with a department that's really in a great position to move forward. I think we've made some great strides here over the past 4 or 5 years, or 5 years that I've been the assistant chief. But one of the reasons that I'm really excited about the opportunity to be the next fire chief is that I have a vision for what this fire department could be. The fire department has a saying that we say half in jest, and it goes 100 years of tradition unimpeded by progress. Well, I've been happy to say that we've been able to get through that impediment over the last few years. And my plan is to continue upon that progress and build upon it. I can envision the Minneapolis Fire Department as an industry leader in the fire service, not only for the soundness of our technical operations and how we respond to emergencies and things like that, but in our processes, the processes that seem to have hamstrung the fire service for many years. Processes such as hiring, processes such as promotion, the creation of pathways programs, community service and engagement, which if you look at the citizen surveys, fire department is on top of, above all other city departments every year. I'll just take a little moment to brag about that, but I actually think that there are opportunities for us to do more and to do better. And of course, I plan on continuing and expanding upon our efforts in diversity and inclusion. Racial diversity and gender diversity is really what we usually talk about when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, but I'd actually like to expand upon that. Diversity of thought, diversity of experience. Our city is full of it. And my plan is to actively recruit and harness that diversity, excuse me, to spur innovation within the fire service. I believe that the Minneapolis Fire Department can become the fire department that other departments in the fire service emulate as they seek to improve and evolve in the fire service. My vision also involves investing time and resources into leadership. When we put together the EMS Pathways program, it was about growing our own firefighters, is what we like to say. Well, I'd like to put some investment into growing our own leaders. Can be only one fire chief at a time, but other fire departments need fire chiefs too. And I believe that they can find those right here in the Minneapolis Fire Department. My plan is to invest time and resources into leadership development, a robust succession plan, which would include mentoring, which would include career and other rank exploration prior to the time when one is expected to or one would apply for it. And by creating advancement opportunities that people can actually move into. Hopefully, you all have had the opportunity to review my resume. And if you haven't, I would be happy to provide one to you if you'd like. But in addition to the listed experience and educational achievements found in that resume, I'd like to briefly discuss three major strengths that I have developed over the course of my career. The first one is I've developed great interpersonal skills. Those skills allow me to work with individuals in all levels of the department, throughout the city structure, and throughout the community. Those skills also will allow me to successfully lead the department toward the achievement of the critical goals and objectives that are currently being outlined for this community. Secondly, I've developed excellent conceptual skills. I have the ability to provide guidance and assist my staff on multiple projects while maintaining an overall focus on the broader vision of the enterprise. And by combining these two skills, I'm able to explain to the members of the department why they are assigned specific tasks each day and how those tasks fit into the larger picture regarding the enterprise's stated goals. And lastly, I've developed and I've been able to really, demonstrate great diagnostic skills. I have the ability to take complex problems and break them down layer by layer until I'm able to identify the core issue. From there, I'm able to craft and implement real solutions that not only address each of the layers of the concern, but also I'm able to design solutions that prevent the organization from ever having to readdress the core problem again. I believe that it is the combination of these three attributes, the success I've been able to achieve with them, the experience I've acquired throughout my 25, almost 26-year career now, in the various positions that I've held throughout my service in the fire department, my formal education, which includes a bachelor's degree in fire administration, and the executive fire officer certification, which was bestowed upon me by the U.S. Congress after completion of a 4-year program, or very rigorous program, I might add, at the U.S. Fire Academy that gives me the confidence to immediately step into this position. I believe that the skills I have, my leadership style, and the requirements of this job to be an excellent fit. So with the sincere hope of garnering the support of each of you today, it would be my distinct honor to apply each of these attributes and all of my experiences to the betterment of this department and this community. And I'm not just asking you to vote to push my nomination forward, so to speak, which is important, but I'm also asking each of you to partner with me to see this vision for this fire department come through to fruition. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have them, or move on with the public hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, AC Tyner. That was amazing, and I really appreciate your vision and the energy that you brought, even just here today, but overall to this department. So thank you so much. We are currently in a public hearing, but if you'll stick around when we close it, I'll open it up to my colleagues to see if they have any questions. Does that sound good?
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, sir. And thank you for taking the time to speak to the committee today. Next up, we have Barbara Johnson, followed by James Thomas with Tyrell on deck. Ms. Johnson, if you'll push *6, wait a moment, and then the floor is yours.
This is Barbara Johnson, former Minneapolis City Council president, and I just am honored today to be able to speak on behalf of Brian Tyner, who I've known for many, many years, and I'm so pleased that the mayor has forwarded his name for appointment to Minneapolis's fire chief. You know, many of you know I have a long history of family with the fire department. My father was a Minneapolis firefighter. Died at age 40 of lung cancer. My two uncles were firefighters in Minneapolis. And the Minneapolis Fire Department has a long tradition of fine fire service to our city. And Brian will continue that great reputation. And I think also, as he pointed out in his remarks, be forward-looking in the service that our professional fire department can provide to the safety of the people in Minneapolis, both those that live here and the people that come in for work or for, you know, entertainment purposes. We have the strongest fire department in the state of Minnesota, and Brian will be a great leader, I think, for that department. So I'm really pleased that he's up for this appointment. I would say also to council members that one of the things that I really valued about him was he was extremely responsive when I was a council member. You know, if I had an issue, he called me right back, was fully aware of the power that the fire department has in, you know, working for safety in our city. And also that he's one of these people that is absolutely unflappable when criticized. So he has some really great personal qualities, I would say. And, you know, I served with 6 fire chiefs during the time that I was on the city council. And Brian will be the 4th fire chief that is from North Minneapolis. And so that's quite a remarkable stretch. And it reflects what a strong community North Minneapolis is. And I'm just so pleased again that Brian is willing to serve in this really super important job in the largest city in our state. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today, and thank you for the shout out to the North Side. It's really great that we have such strong representation of leadership in the fire department from North Minneapolis. Much to your point, it demonstrates the strength of our community over here on the North Side, so thank you for bringing that up. Next up, we have James Thomas, followed by Tyrell, with Ashanti Payne on deck. James, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we sure can. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for recognizing me. I want to thank you and the council for this opportunity to lift my voice in response and support of Mr. Brian Tyner. And let me also thank the fire and police departments for what you do. Your work is greatly appreciated. Brian has been a part of the Mount Oliver Church, of which I pastored for a number of years. I know his family very well. And so I'm certainly happy to support him in this effort. And I appreciate Mayor Fry for nominating him for this position. I do want to echo the mayor's remarks that he's a young man who grew up on the North Side. He's come up through the ranks. You can tell from the remarks that he just made that he's going to hit the ground running. He won't be thinking about what's next or what to do. He's already prepared. So the council would do well and also do great by the community by selecting him. The one thing I do want to add is that having Mr. Tyner as your chief is a positive role model for everybody, but especially it's a positive role model for Black and brown children, so that they can understand that people can achieve and there's another opportunity to do some things in this life other than stuff that's just crazy. So I want to just support him and support what's being done. And again, I'm appreciative of the fact that you've chosen, again, another North Sider. I live in St. Paul. I wish we could have had him over here as chief, but fates have determined that he'd be in Minneapolis. So I congratulate you.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Much appreciated having you here. We are blessed and lucky to have him here over in Minneapolis. Next up, we have Tyrell, followed by Ashanti Payne with Charles Rucker on deck. Mr. Tyrell, are you on the line? Please push *6.
Mr. Chair, can you hear me?
Yes, we sure can. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Tyrell. I'm president of the African American Leadership Council of St. Paul, but I'm also a member of the National Coalition Against Racism in Sports and Media, which is the organization that fights against racism in sports, particularly the Washington Redskins, Kansas City Chiefs, and others, led by Clyde Bellacourt, David Glass, and others that we've been doing for 3 decades. And so I come wearing 2 hats today for the African American Leadership Council, but also the coalition in our support for Chief Tyner. People say, well, why would people from St. Paul be excited and elated about a Minneapolis fire chief? Because we believe strongly that while we have 2 different cities, we are the Twin Cities. And in many ways, for African American people and people of color, we are one city. We go and live and work in between both cities. And Brian is not only a great fire chief, but a great man. And I don't think you can have one without the other if you're going to do the job well. And we've had the opportunity to work with him closely the last 2 or 3 years. As Reverend Thomas said, we wanted him to be our fire chief. And we're open about that. And no disrespect to Chief Inc., because we have great love for him now. But you guys have a young man that we believe will make your department the best department, not only in the state of Minnesota, probably the country. The other departments will look at and want to emulate what you're doing in Minneapolis. So you have the strong support from not only Minneapolis, but on both sides of the river for this chief. We will do everything that he needs to be successful. And so our support is not just today, but any day that he needs us to call on him or him call on us, we will do that. So I hope you will find it in your wisdom and knowledge as great leaders to make Brian Tyner your next Minneapolis Fire Chief. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here today, Mr. Tyrell. Next up, we have Ashanti Payne, followed by Charles Rucker with Jonna Hull on deck. Ashanti, are you on the line?
Yes, can you hear me?
You sure can. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Chair and committee members, for this opportunity to come and say a few words about Brian Tyner, a man I know very well. I have known Brian forever, and when I say forever, it goes back to when we weren't even conscious of the fact that we knew each other on Russell Avenue. Then from attending daycare together at the Northside Child Development Center, and then moving on to when I was in the 5th grade, and my mother made me go to this private school called Breck, where Brian was already there, and he served as a mentor and a role model and helped me navigate a world that was completely foreign to me. To now where we have transitioned to a point to where I can provide regular fishing lessons for Brian over the summer. He is a man of great integrity, a sense of community, and connected to the Minneapolis community from the north side to the south side. I am proud of the accomplishments both in his personal life and his career thus far. I'm honored to be able to call him a friend, and even more privileged to be able to call him a big brother. I cannot think of a better representative and protector of a city that I love dearly. So I hope that it is in your hearts and in your minds and wisdom to appoint Brian Tyner as Fire Chief of Minneapolis. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Mr. Payne, for that. That's really amazing. Thank you for being here to take your time and speak to this appointment. Next up, we have Charles Rucker, followed by Jonna Hull with Mark Lakowski on deck.
Charles Rucker. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Welcome.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chair, for your time and allowing me to speak today at this public hearing. I would just want to start off by saying I'm a resident of Minneapolis, firefighter, and president of Minneapolis African American Professional Firefighter Association. I'm in 100% in support of Chief Tyner's nomination. The reason being is Chief Tyner is a trailblazer, very knowledgeable, cares and has passion for the city of Minneapolis and the fire department. Chief Tyner has put in hard work to put himself in a position to become the next chief of Minneapolis Fire Department. Received his degree, attended leadership and fire service conferences, worked every position on the fire department, and he has authored and implemented several programs such as the Explorer program, the Pathway program for diversity on the fire department, EMS program in Minneapolis, Minneapolis high schools such as Roosevelt and North high schools. Quick Plan, implemented the commercial inspection and hood inspection program. Chief Tyner has implemented the CPAT tests, candidate physical ability tests, and he's always in the community, working in partnership with Girls in Action with Dr. Verna Price, Urban League Family Day, Juneteenth, NIDCAT, Network for Development Children of African Descent, even goes over to Rondo Days in St. Paul, school programs, safety and career, works with Region Hospital Burn Unit. It's a camp for kids that have been unfortunately burned in a fire or something, and then they would send the kids off to Camp Greeley in Colorado. Sponsored kids for that. North side of Minneapolis, south side of Minneapolis, partnership with the Minnesota Vikings turkey basket giveaway. We had got up to 5,000 turkey baskets that we would give for Thanksgiving for people that needed assistance with their their dinners. Chief Tyner, he's nationally known. There's a lot of programs that we implemented that other departments implemented. Just for example, there were other, there's other national fire departments. They will always ask, what are you doing to have a diverse department? And the answer would always be programs Chief Tyner authored or implemented. So when a woman or African American person of color joins the ranks of Minneapolis firefighters as a Minneapolis firefighter, and later in their career promotes to fire motor operator, which is a driver on our department, a captain, battalion chief, deputy chief, it's not a milestone for us as it is for other departments across the nation. It's a standard because of what Chief Tyner has put in place. You have to recruit people that look like your community. So with that being said, Chief Tyner would make a great chief for the city of Minneapolis. I get several calls from across the nation. People would ask, hey, who's this Chief Tyner? What are these things that he's doing up in Minneapolis, since I'm the president of the MAFA? And I would just say he doesn't want to go anywhere because he wants to be the chief of Minneapolis. And I would tell him, no, my passion is to be the chief of Minneapolis. But Chief Tyner is a true leader, and how I would define that is a person who can move people to action. And that's what he does. With what I said earlier about the programs and the things that he has done in the community. So with that being said, we're behind him 100% of being the next chief of city of Minneapolis. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for being here today, Mr. Rucker. Great to hear from you, and thank you for your service. Next up, we have Jana Hull, followed by Mark Lukowski, followed with Makeda Zulu Gillespie on deck. Jana, are you there? Please push *6. Right, well, we'll circle back to Jana here. And next up, we have Mark Lukowski, followed by Makeda Zulu Gillespie. Mark, please push *6, wait a moment, and then the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, council member and other council members present. Hope everybody's doing well today. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak on behalf of Chief Tyner. I'd like to make it real easy for you and just concur with everything everybody said today. And that would keep it real short, but that would be too easy. First of all, I'd really like to say, because it started the whole process, I've been involved in the selection process from the beginning, and I must tell you, we had some really qualified candidates. But one of the things that Mayor Fry has certainly shown, and I'm very appreciative in the selection of selecting an in-house candidate in Chief Tyner. Though some of the candidates, like I said, they interviewed very well, and they certainly had a resume. It's been my experience in my position that you could come in prepared to these interviews, and you could say you can hit the hot spots and the trendy buttons and what's going on. But the fact of the matter is, if you don't get Minneapolis and you don't understand Minneapolis and understand what we're doing, what we've done in the past, and where we're trying to take this forward, it's just sound bites to me. And I'm very, very happy to say that Brian, Chief Tyner, understands all those pieces. So very grateful for Mayor Fry, first of all, for moving him forward. I've known Brian for about 20 years now, and I've worked with him very closely this last 3 years. I am the president of Minneapolis Fire Local 82, and have the opportunity to work with Brian in many ways that others won't. And I got to tell you, he is being very true when he talked about his trades, his integrity, and everything else involved. One of the things I admire the most about Chief Tyner is, and certainly of recent and going forward this next year, we're in trying times on a number of things. But you do not leave that room, and you do not leave a meeting with Chief Tyner not believing that your position or your message was heard and it was and that it was understood. He doesn't shut you down. He's open-minded, and he's up for discussion on everything. And certainly with the understanding as there's going to be times where we don't agree on everything. But just the start of it, his integrity is open. And everything he takes forward in those meetings is really appreciated by Local 82. One of the bigger pieces I've learned is we are so far ahead of everybody. I've traveled all over the United States with the union, and it stopped shocking me years ago to see how far ahead of we are in so many states as far as our push for diversity and inclusion and opportunity for everybody. Brian's been a part of that in the city of Minneapolis since before me. He's been a strong part of it when I've been working with them and supporting all the programs locally to develop pathways together. And Brian was a major partner, driver, and supporter of that program. I personally have been reached out by numerous states, not just fire departments, police departments, and other city departments that have heard about our Pathways program, asking us for any interest. What did we learn through the process? What's working well? And I got to tell you, Brian was a driving factor of that, and it comes from his heart, not just to benefit the people, but he understands by giving these people this opportunity and developing them, it only makes for a better fire department, just like Charles Rucker said, that reflects the city and the residents that we serve. My last big piece that I really think that Chief Tyner represents is one of the things maybe you guys didn't pick up in his pieces. It's the first time I've ever heard it said in my life is one of his goals on the development of people is for, because we had plenty of outstate people interview for his spot, but rarely do we get our people leaving and interviewing for chief spots. But when he mentioned developing our people so that other cities are looking to Minneapolis and quite frankly trying to snatch our leaders to help lead their department and help them bring them up to the level that we're at now. Operationally, we do a great job, and we're obviously, busting at the seams. We're just that busy. But on the administrative side, even the part that Brian's going to bring with this succession planning and in developing leaders, but not just on paper. We've had a plan on paper for years, but I truly believe in Brian's mission on pointing the way, showing the direction, and showing true opportunity. And he's going to actually bring in new faces. And once you bring the faces in and people see these plans happening, you get the buy-in and you get the development. I believe everything he's saying. I think he's going to make those changes. And I'm very happy as president of Local 82 to sit here today and support him, and not just moving forward, hopefully with the confirmation and everything after that. I don't believe you guys could have had a better choice, and I hope it's unanimous. And I am certainly available for questions, but like I said, 100% support Chief Tyner now and hopefully after your confirmation. So thanks for the time, Council, and I appreciate it. You guys have a great day.
Thank you so much for being here and for being a part of this conversation, and thank you for your service as well. Next up, we have Makeda Zulu Gillespie, and then we'll circle back around to see if Jana is on the line. Miss Zulu Gillespie, are you on the line? Please push *6. All right. We might be having, not sure if Makeda, it seems, Makeda, that you muted yourself, so maybe push *6 one more time and just wait a moment and you'll hear a recording. All right, seems like we might be having some issues, so let me go circle back to see if Jana Hull is on the line. If so, please push *6. Oh, there she is. Hello.
This is what happens with old people. So forgive me. Thank you, Chair Cunningham, for allowing me to speak today, and committee members. This is a wonderful opportunity to speak to Brian Tyner's candidacy for appointment for fire chief. I have known Brian also for a very long time, and in case folks are wondering about that St. Paul connection, he was born in St. Paul and then moved to North Minneapolis. And while he was a mentor to Ashanti, both Brian and Ashanti were mentors to me as I traveled through North Minneapolis. So I'm appreciative of that. I am a Minneapolis resident and also the executive director of the University of Minnesota's Robert J. Jones Urban Research Outreach and Engagement Center. And so I want to speak a little bit about in that role. In Tyner's past and current roles, he has been visible in our community. He has been seen not only in City Hall, but around the community and on television, serving as an example for all, but especially as a great role model for young Black and brown boys. We have noticed more diversity in the ranks of the fire department in recent years. This hasn't always been the case. Tyner has put vision into action with the Minneapolis Fire Department's EMS Pathways program, helping create ways to help the fire department become more diverse within its ranks. We have also seen the fire department hiring practices change for the better by removing unnecessary barriers that prevented qualified, diverse candidates from being hired. We know that this work and impact didn't happen until the promotion of then Battalion Chief Tyner to Deputy Chief position. We are proud and approve of Tyner's work in the department and in the community. Tyner understands the critical embedded institutional issues such as the social construct of race and its impact on institutional racism and anti-Blackness. As Fire Chief, Tyner will continue the city's goal of addressing the fire department's internal organization culture and climate to ensure a respectful and productive work environment. He is committed and has a proven record in dismantling bad practices and implementing new and just practices in the department that benefit the department, the city, and its residents. Tyner has the technical and conceptual skills to champion internal and external changes in a paramilitary organization that is increasingly becoming more diverse. Tyner is a bridge builder, team player, an effective leader when it comes to solving problems or seizing a productive opportunity, like eliminating unnecessary barriers. Tyner has been and will continue to be an asset for the city of Minneapolis and our community. Thank you also Mayor Frye for sending him forward as a candidate to the City Council. And lastly, I will end on what is one of the most important things that Tyner has done for me. My goal for high school was to be a high school cheerleader at North High. My mother had different dreams for me, and so I got to be a cheerleader for the Breck Mustangs, one of 2 cheerleaders. So I thank you for this opportunity today. Thank you. And I look forward to your decision.
Thank you so much, and thanks for that little story there at the end. Just for the record, that was Makeda Zulu Gillespie. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here and to speak your support. I will circle back one last time to see if we have Jonna Hull on the line. All right, not hearing. Anyone else? Is there anyone else here who maybe did not sign up, just to make sure? Is there anyone else here who would like to speak to this public hearing item? All right. Hearing none, with that, I will now close the public hearing, and I will move approval of item number 1, which is approving the appointment of Brian Tyner to the position of the fire department. With that, is there any discussion from my colleagues? Councilmember Fletcher.
I just want to say thank you and congratulations to Brian Tyner for stepping up into this role. I think it's very exciting to hear your vision and enthusiasm and energy. You have big shoes to fill. This is a well-run department, as you said. This is a department that's a source of pride for our city, and we're counting on you to enact your vision to make it even stronger. But just know that hearing the support of your friends and your colleagues in the community, I think it is an easy yes vote today, and I appreciate you making it so.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to support this nomination and really appreciate all the people that went into bringing forward Brian Tyner's name for us for consideration today. And I think it's really exciting and affirming to see those from the community and from your past, Brian, coming forward and speaking up for you, as well as the workers in the department who are standing up and saying that they're with you to move forward. Clearly, our fire department has been an outstanding department in the past, and I think a lot to the credit of you and being a part of the leadership team there for all these years. I am anticipating there'll be big expectations that will keep coming, maybe even more demands to do more, to do less during these difficult times, and also to lead us as a city and how we can have a workforce that better reflects those who live in the city, which the department has certainly already been doing. So I look forward to working with you and am enthusiastically supporting your appointment.
Thank you, Councilmember Gordon. Are there any other colleagues that would like to speak to this item? All right, seeing none, I will just take a quick moment here to enthusiastically speak my support for this appointment. I am so grateful for the leadership of Chief Tyner, and am excited to be able to step into this new relationship with him as the chief of the fire department. It's always very exciting to see leadership from North Minneapolis see that in the city. I think that's really important because we have unique challenges in North Minneapolis, but we also have unique assets and gifts that we offer to the city. And having somebody who is in a leadership position that understands firsthand the value of our people in North Minneapolis and what a gift that those residents bring to the city as employees, and really creating accessible ways to be able to become firefighters. I just think that that's so exciting, and I'm grateful for that. I also do want to make sure to say, speak my immense gratitude for Chief Friedel for all that you've done. Thank you for your leadership, for your innovation, for also being intentional about cultivating leadership. We are here today as a mix of a lot of good leaders coming together, with the chief making sure that he's creating space for developing leadership, for the skills that that Chief Tyner has developed over time. Really phenomenal work, and we are very fortunate as a city. So, seeing no further discussion, and I have already moved approval of that item, I will ask the clerk to please call the roll.
Councilmember Gordon?
Aye.
Cannell?
Aye.
Ellison?
Aye.
Palmisano?
Aye.
Fletcher?
Aye.
Chair Cunningham?
Aye.
There's 6 ayes.
That item carries, and that recommendation will be referred to the City Council meeting next Friday for final action. Congratulations to Chief Tyner for the next step in this process. And thank you to everyone for being here today and speaking at the public hearing. Next up, we will move on to the consent agenda, which is items number 2 through 5 on the agenda. Item number 2 is authorizing the submittal of a grant application to the Minnesota Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management in the amount of $15,000 over a 1-year period to support the Office of Emergency Management's COVID-19 response and recovery operations. Item number 3 is authorizing the submittal of a grant application to the Minnesota Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management in the amount of $829,500 over an 18-month period to support the city's efforts in the prevention, preparation, mitigation, response, and recovery of acts of terrorism and other hazards. Item number 4 is authorizing the submittal of a grant application to the Minnesota Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, the amount of $30,000 over a 1-year period to support the Office of Emergency Management's mission areas of prevention, preparation, mitigation, response, and recovery. And item number 5 is authorizing master contracts with eligible provider lists for community nonprofit agencies and governmental and political entities for the Minneapolis Health Department. With that, is there any discussion on the consent agenda, or are there any items that anyone would like to pull off for discussion? Seeing none, I will just say thank you to the Office of Emergency Management. As we see, there's quite a lot of grant work that is happening. So thank you to Alec for all of his hard work with making sure that we are bringing in dollars into the city to make sure that we are providing solid services related to emergency management. So thank you to Alec and to the whole team in the Office of Emergency Management. Seeing no discussion, I'll move approval of the consent agenda, and we'll ask the clerk to please call the roll.
Councilmember Gordon.
Aye.
Pennell. Councilmember Cano.
Aye.
Ellison.
Aye.
Palmisano.
Aye.
Fletcher.
Aye.
Chair Cunningham.
Aye.
There's 6 ayes.
Those items carry and the consent agenda is approved. Now we will move on to our discussion items. Colleagues, for our first, we will be having 2 discussion items today. The first is on receiving and filing a presentation from the Public Health Advisory Committee on efforts to prevent childhood lead poisoning in Minneapolis. I understand that Margaret Schuster from our health department will kick off that presentation and introduce members of the Public Health Advisory Committee. Margaret Schuster, are you here on the line?
I am. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay?
Yes, we can. Welcome.
Yes, thank you so much for having the Public Health Advisory Committee members provide this presentation for you. I am going to turn it over to Jerome Evans, who is a co-chair of the committee, and he will lead off, followed by Mary Pike, who will provide a bit of the why is this important information, and then followed by Paul Pentel, who is going to deliver sort of the meat of the presentation about how to move forward in preventing childhood lead poisoning in Minneapolis. So I will be happy to turn it over to Jerome Evans and let him introduce himself and begin the presentation.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for having us today. My name is Jerome Evans, and I co-chair the Public Health Advisory Committee. Our committee brings together health experts from across Minneapolis who volunteer their time and energy for the betterment of our city. Today, we are presenting recommendations that will help close systemic inequities in Minneapolis. Specifically, we are recommending that the city move to eliminate lead-based paint in our homes. My fellow committee members, Mary Pike and Dr. Paul Pentel, will present data that shows that lead-based paint is a hazard to the children of Minneapolis, that exposure to this toxin has profound, negative, lifelong effects, and that people with black bodies, brown bodies, or lower incomes are far more likely to be exposed to this toxic substance. And to be crystal clear, the data that we are presenting comes from children who have already been exposed to, who have already ingested, and who will be impacted by this toxin for the rest of their lives. But that said, we are also coming to you with a way to address this finite, measurable, and relatively easy to solve problem. We have within our power the ability to take a discrete set of actions that will reduce racial and income-based disparities in our city. We can preventatively remediate lead hazards before our children are exposed to it. And it is the recommendation of the Public Health Advisory Committee that the city adopt the following recommendations to do so. Mary Pike, who is presenting next, is the committee representative from Ward 3, and she carries with her 40 years of experience in public health. She will be providing some background and context. Dr. Paul Pentel will follow Mary with a closer examination of the recommendation. Thank you very much for your attention today. Please take it away, Mary.
Chair Cunningham and committee members, I'm Mary Pike. I represent Ward 3. I worked for many years as the manager of Ramsey County's WIC program. It was very rewarding work. We helped tens of thousands of kids get a healthy start in life. But there were some huge frustrations. As part of our work, we checked the iron status of the WIC children by doing hemoglobin tests. When we identified children with low hemoglobins, we referred them to their healthcare providers. The low hemoglobins could be corrected with changes in diet and iron supplements. But some of the children with low hemoglobins were found to have been poisoned by lead. And for many of them, the damage was severe and permanent. That was heartbreaking, and that is why I am so interested in this problem. Next slide, please. In our city, almost 300 children have been poisoned by lead over the last 3 years. Next slide, please. The effects of childhood lead poisoning on children's brains are devastating. Even the small changes in memory, reasoning, judgment, and behavior caused by childhood lead poisoning can make an enormous difference in a child's life. The difference in being able to hold a job or not, the difference in living independently or not, the difference in being involved with law enforcement or not. The list of victims of childhood lead poisoning includes Freddie Gray of Baltimore. Next slide, please. The map on the left shows Minneapolis neighborhoods with high poverty. The middle map shows Minneapolis neighborhoods with over 60% residents of color. And on the right, the map shows where childhood lead poisonings occurred over a recent 15-year period in our city. There is astonishing overlap here. The map of childhood lead poisoning is a map of poverty and racial inequity. Next slide, please. Childhood lead poisoning is a problem we can solve. We know the cause, we know how to identify the cause, and we know how to remove or mitigate the cause. There is no mystery here. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Pentel.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Chair Cunningham, committee members, thanks for the opportunity to be here today. We weren't able to get my video going for some reason, so I can't see the slides as you're looking at them. Just please let me know if they get out of sync. Could we go to my first slide? It's number 6 in the stack, and it's guideline for accelerating efforts to prevent lead poisoning. So I am Paul Pentel. I'm the Ward 7 representative on the advisory committee. I'm an internist at Hennepin Healthcare. I've got additional training in toxicology, so early in my career, I was the medical backup for the Hennepin Poison Center. And in that capacity, I helped to take care of children with lead poisoning, some who had very high lead levels. And what I remember best from doing that is this sinking feeling that I would get that the damage is done and all I can do is try to keep it from getting worse. Since then, we have learned that that damage occurs even at very low blood lead levels of 5 to 10, just barely above the cutoff of 5 micrograms per deciliter that health departments use to intervene. Now, the Minneapolis Health Department has superb programs in place for dealing with kids who have elevated blood lead levels. They'll get into the home, find out where it's coming from, and have those hazards removed. But the resources and the reach of the health department are limited. And as a result, there are a couple of very important limitations on our efforts. The next slide should be number 7. So the first is we're intervening too late. We're reacting to poisonings that have already occurred rather than preventing them. Now, managing elevated or intervening when kids have elevated blood lead levels is the right priority. It's the most immediate need. But in relying on this, it's just taking too long. It's driving down the number of elevated blood lead levels that are identified each year. But at the current rate of inspections and remediations, it's going to take literally decades to eliminate lead exposure hazards from just the highest risk housing. Next slide, please. Proposed strategy. So what we are proposing is based on two themes. The first is the health department has existing very effective programs, and we can build on these. We can use them to accelerate efforts to eliminate lead hazards. But there's a critical gap in our current capacity. The city currently has no requirement to inspect or identify lead hazards in housing and has no mechanism for doing this. So lead hazards are not, looking for lead hazards is not a part of routine housing inspections. The ability to get into and to inspect high-risk housing is absolutely essential if we're going to identify and eliminate lead hazards. Next slide, please. It's scope of the problem. So the scope is very large. Lead has been added to paint for centuries because it improves its properties. It's been recognized as a danger to children for hundreds of years. And the League of Nations actually recommended banning lead paint 99 years ago. But the use of lead paint was fiercely defended by industry, so the lead content of indoor paint was only first regulated in the US in 1978. And the legacy we're left with is that half of all Twin Cities homes, because they're built before 78, are presumed to contain lead-based paint. Now, addressing such a large problem is overwhelming, and what we are proposing is a tiered approach, which would involve first identifying the very highest risk housing and focusing on that so that we can have the greatest impact in the shortest time. Next slide, please. In this figure, every blue dot is a child with an elevated blood lead level. This is from our health department over a period of 3 years. The blood level is shown in the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis is the age of the housing. So it's clear that most of these, the vast majority of these poisonings are happening with children living in older housing. The reason for this is that before 1930, the levels of lead in paint were even higher than afterward. And also, this housing is simply older and is more likely to be in disrepair. Next slide, please. This is the same map that Mary showed you just a minute ago. Clearly, one of the ways that we can focus on high-risk areas is by location. There are these 3 areas within Minneapolis where lead poisoning is concentrated. Within those areas, there are 5 neighborhoods with particularly high concentrations of lead poisoning. And these are primarily from rental units, so that's the focus of this proposal. Next slide, please. So using this information of building age and location, we can start to narrow things down. There's 94,000 licensed rental units in the city. Just over a third of those are pre-1930. And if we look just at the highest risk neighborhoods, there's 5,100 rental units that represent the very highest risk housing in the entire city. And this is a place that we could start. Next slide, please. So currently, the health department is doing exactly what it should be doing with the resources it has available. It's addressing the most immediate need, and that's intervening when a child has an elevated blood lead level. And when the health department is notified of an elevated blood level, it will get into the home, inspect the housing, see where the lead exposure is coming from, and then work with property owners to arrange remediation. So they will identify grant funding to help to defray the cost. They'll assist in finding, hiring the contractors, and then assure that the work has been completed and that it's satisfactory. Next slide, please. The actual work is fairly straightforward. The most common source of lead exposure in Minneapolis is windows and their frames. Other worn painted surfaces contribute, but the windows and frames are the big one. So the chips, flakes, and dust from peeling or worn painted surfaces then get onto the floor. Floors are where toddlers spend their time, so this gets onto their clothes, their toys. It gets on their hands. They put their hands in their mouth and they ingest the lead. So some of the worn surfaces, if they're not in very bad shape, can be painted over and then maintained by the landlord. But often they're in very bad shape, and a more permanent solution is replacement of the entire window and frame. It's a big job, but it's usually accomplished in 1 or 2 days, and it generally does not require moving tenants to temporary housing. The cost depends on the extent of the work needed, but generally about half can be covered by grants. And with this scheme, building owner cooperation has been good. Next slide, please. So with focusing on the 5,100 highest risk units, how long would this take? Well, not all of the units will have lead hazards, although most probably do in these areas. Some have already been inspected and remediated, and some can have their surfaces painted over rather than a full remediation. So just for the sake of argument, if about half of those units need full remediation, it would take 850 full remediations each year to reach all these units over a period of 3 years, which the advisory committee thought was a reasonable goal. To put this in perspective, in 2019, the health department oversaw remediation of 175 units where the remediation was triggered by an elevated blood level. At that rate, it would take 15 years to reach just these highest risk units. And clearly, we want to move faster than this. Next slide, please. And in order to do this, what we're suggesting is a shift to preventive inspections. So the current health department efforts are triggered by an elevated blood level. What we're proposing adding is another component using a model of shared responsibility, and the critical piece here is bringing in the regulatory services department to partner with the health department. And the role of regulatory services would be to get into and inspect this high-risk housing, to do a rapid screen to see if there are potential lead problems, and then refer these to the health department, where it can do exactly what it's already doing, a more thorough inspection, evaluation, and remediation if that's called for. Every city that I'm aware of that is addressing the prevention of lead poisoning in children in a meaningful way uses a partnership between their equivalent of regulatory services and the health department as the core of that effort. It's very necessary. Next slide, please. So the inspections, the screenings that would need to be done by housing inspectors should be straightforward and brief. On the left, lead paint, deteriorated lead paint has a characteristic appearance, the way it peels and curls, but it's not even necessary to be able to identify that visually. Any peeling or worn paint in a pre-1930 home is presumed to contain lead. So it's only necessary to look at the painted surfaces, and if they're worn, flag them and refer them to the health department. Next slide, please. So regulatory services then would essentially be considering lead-based paint as in the same way as other safety hazards that they routinely inspect and take care of, like gas, electric, plumbing, and construction, and could add this screening on to routine housing inspections. In addition, for this to work, they would also need to prioritize, get into and inspect these high-risk units and flag them for the health department. This model, this approach is one that the health department and the regulatory services department are already interested in. The next slide, please. A year ago, they proposed a shared position between the two departments, a person to coordinate efforts between them and to jumpstart this effort to enable preventive inspections. This position was approved and was in the 2020 budget, but hasn't been hired. It's been on hold because of the hiring freeze. Next slide, please. So what the advisory committee is asking of the city is these two things. The first is to establish and commit to a comprehensive plan to substantially accelerate our efforts to prevent lead poisoning. And the key features would be moving to a prevention model, enabling this partnership between departments, and also setting measurable goals and timetables so that we can see if it's working the way we want it to. We also strongly encourage the City Council to make every effort to prioritize moving forward with the shared health and housing coordinator position, because it really is needed in order to get the effort started. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, what we're proposing doesn't take care of the entire problem. It's really addressing just 7% of the at-risk housing stock. But what it would do is rapidly deal with the highest risk housing, and then it could serve as a pilot program to be refined and then rolled out to start addressing it for the rest. Finally, I would just like to say that the advisory committee is very acutely aware of the time, effort, and resources that the city is needing to put into addressing the COVID-19 pandemic right now. One thing we've learned in the health care sector and hospitals and clinics is that, of course, we need to do this, but we can't defer all other care, can't postpone addressing all other medical problems. The downstream costs are simply too great. So in the public health arena, we would suggest that preventing childhood lead poisoning should be viewed through the same light. The consequences are simply so great, and the disparities in its distribution so startling that we simply need to get a meaningful start on moving towards prevention. Thank you. We're happy to take questions if there is time.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Incredibly informative with very clear next steps and recommendations. I know that you all serve in a volunteer capacity, so we wouldn't be able to do this work without you taking that time to be of service to the city. So thank you so much for doing so. Do any of my colleagues have any questions or comments related to this presentation? Well, I will go ahead and just add that prior to stepping into local government, that as many folks know, I was a special education teacher, and I worked with young people who had moderate to severe cognitive disabilities. So I did work with young people who had experienced lead poisoning, and particularly young adults, late teens, early adults. And, you know, in speaking to their parents, you know, they would say that their children were progressing and developing completely on track with healthy development. And then all of a sudden they regressed completely back. Some of them had lost their speech abilities. Some just experience, well, I shouldn't say just, but like some experience extreme, a sudden shift in antisocial behaviors. So very impulsive, very aggressive. And when we look at the broader impacts, this is a factor in public safety. Folks don't necessarily think about it that way, but it does absolutely play a role in public safety. And oftentimes when it comes to the city and other levels of government, it is about the folks kind of pass off the responsibility of children to the schools or to the parks. But this is a prime example of where and why the city should step up for the children in our city. So so thank you all so much for this presentation. I know that I myself will be following up to be able to get more specifics and dig into this a little bit more to see how we can best operationalize it now moving forward. So with that, Councilmember Gordon.
Yeah, I apologize if maybe I missed this, but I was intrigued with the idea. And first of all, I want to say thank you very much for the presentation. And I also want to recognize that I think our staff in regulatory services and rental licensing has recognized and has done a good job of partnering also with our health department staff, and we have to keep doing that. I wasn't sure if this shared position is something that has come through with the mayor's recommended budget and that they're advocating for, or if they're suggesting that we need to look at adding a position there. And I wonder if anybody can just clarify that for me. And I'm sorry if I missed that during the presentation.
Councilmember Gordon, and please correct me if I did not hear this correctly, team, but if I heard correctly, this position has already been approved, that it just has not been filled. It's currently vacant because of the hiring freeze. Oh. So a recommendation with prioritizing that.
Do we know if they've even tried to get a waiver to fill the position? Maybe Patrick Hanlon can help.
I do see Patrick Hanlon, Director of Environmental Services, is on the line. So Patrick, would you like to dive into this a little bit for us?
Sure, Chair Cunningham, council members. Yeah, the position has not been, it was approved this year. It has not been cut per se, but we have a hiring freeze. And so we are looking at prioritizing, you know, we've had the good fortune of having a couple, the lead and Healthy Homes HUD grant that came through and some environmental justice grants. And so we're looking at pulling together some of the resources that we have, understanding that we are very limited in our general funds for next year to see what we can pull together in terms of grant funding to make a waiver request possible, hopefully in Q1 of next year.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you for that. Thank you for that question. I think that's a very key recommended next step that bubbled up. So thank you, Councilmember Gordon, for creating more space for clarification. Is there any other question? Are there any other questions or comments related to this presentation from my colleagues? All right. With that, I will direct the clerk to please file that report. Next, colleagues, we have item number 7. Oh, I'm sorry, there's actually technically 3 presentations, but both the next 2 are connected with community safety. So first up, we'll have a receiving and filing a presentation on community safety. We have staff from both the police department and the health department's Office of Violence Prevention on hand to give this presentation. I do believe that we might have Commander Case here to kick us off. Is that correct?
Good afternoon, Councilmember Cunningham.
Good afternoon.
Yes, I'll be speaking to the public safety part of for the presentation on the police department, and this is kind of a new format. So for the person running the presentation, if you want to flip through to the next slide. So really what we're going to do is we're going to cover crime trends for the city of Minneapolis year to date. And as we go through this, I'll try to explain some of the nuances of the data that we generally look at daily and weekly in the police department. And so I'm not sure the best process to use for questions. If you normally hold that until the end, might be the easiest. I've got, I think, around 20 slides to go through. The first part of this is going to be more data and analytics, and then the second part of the presentation will really be focused around what we're doing as a police department within our department, and then also partnering with the Office of Violence Prevention and some more of the outreach type of programs. So
I will just go ahead and say that maybe if folks have questions about the specific data as it pops up, they can jump in, but we'll pause between the data and the response to see if there's any questions. Does that sound like a good plan of action?
Sounds good.
Great, thank you.
So we can go to the next slide here. And how this is broken down, these are all going to be what's known as Part 1 crimes. And what we've done is we pretty much put those into 2 different categories. So we have violent crimes and property crimes. So first, what we're going to look at in the first couple slides is going to be a citywide look for the entire city. And then in the slides after that, it will be by each precinct, so all 5 precincts. So you'll see some recurring trends occurring, which is consistent with most weeks. When we look at this, we look at citywide trends first, and then we look at the particulars of the precincts to see if there's any type of differences that don't make sense, and then that's what we would focus on. So for the first slide here, this is violent crimes, and for this category, we really break it into several different buckets here. We have homicide, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, and then domestic. And an item of note here, what I'll try to do is go from the top of the slide to the bottom and then left to right. So if you look just in general for violent crimes year to date, so compared to last year, the city is up 23% or roughly 23%. What we then do is we look at a 4-year average to balance that out from the spikes that may have occurred the previous year. So we have a larger data set to look at to give us a better baseline on what that represents. So when we look at our 4-year average, which is on the bottom of the slide, we're at 19.8%. So both trending in the same direction, meaning up. And of the categories that we have listed here, on the far right, you'll see domestic. That's actually a subset of aggravated assault. And we do that because domestic consistently is represented as a subset that trends roughly the same in that aggravated assault category. So if there's questions about that, it's not as though, so that for this year, there's been 790 reported. That's not on top of the aggravated assault of 2668. Just want to make that point. So what this slide really tells us is that there's the 3 major categories of violent crime of increase are really homicide, robbery, and aggravated assault. And so from a policing perspective, those are the types of categories that we want to focus on when developing strategies. And you can go to the next slide, please. And then I'll go through the same process here. So this is property crimes. These are still Part 1 crimes. They're into the separate categories of burglary, larceny, theft from motor vehicle, and auto theft and arson. Theft from motor vehicle is considered larceny, so it's a subset of that category as well, but it's broken out to show some specifics because oftentimes that category drives larceny overall. So year to date, we're up 3.5% from last year, and then compared to the previous 4 years, it's consistent upward trending. It's 10%. And of note on this one is really the theft from motor vehicles, up by 53%. When we look at those types of, I guess, anomalies, one of the things that we'd want to look for is there specific things with theft from motor vehicles. Are certain items being taken? In this specific instance, it's the catalytic converter thefts that are driving that number. And that's a pattern that you'll see as you can go to the next slide, please. So this is going to be the first precinct violent crime. So as we go through these next slides on this deck, you're going to see that same type of pattern existing. So the catalytic converter thefts are consistent pretty much across all precincts. So for the first precinct, violent crimes year to date, they're actually down 1%. And then when you look at the previous 4 years, they're down 2%. And so that is not consistent with the overall trend of the city. And so one of the things that you look at is, well, what is driving that, or why would that be? One of the things that could be causing that is the fact that there's most likely less people downtown right now due to the pandemic. You can go to the next slide, please. And again, this will be the property crimes portion for first precinct. You'll see that there's the same themes coming through here as with the citywide trends. There's a large increase in burglary. You can go to the next slide, please. Slide are we on? Can you tell me what slide? You can go to the next slide number. Oh, perfect. Okay. I'm sorry, back one. It was slow on my computer. Okay, so this is second precinct, violent crimes. And we're up 14% year to date compared to last year. And again, if you look at the 4-year trend, it's up 20%. So trending in the same way. There's no anomalies there to look at. When we read left to right, the homicides have gone down. Rape has gone down. What has gone up is robbery and aggravated assault. So what's inconsistent on this slide compared to the citywide trend is homicide is down. What's of note and why we look at that as far as the particulars go is the actual amount is fairly small. So when you look at the 4-year average, it was 3.5 homicides a year. This year it's 3, so there's not as much difference between those numbers, and that's why you get the decrease in the overall percentage. You can go ahead and flip to the next precinct, or the next slide, please. Okay, so overall, second precinct has increased 22% as compared to 27% in 2019. Or I'm sorry, in 2019, and then 27% when looking at the 4-year average. So again, same consistent patterns, no real outliers here. The auto thefts, when we look at from the property crime slide, the delivery drivers leaving keys in the vehicles are of note, and that's also consistent in the downtown area. I forgot to mention that, but that's a pattern that we see for auto thefts, and then also residents leaving keys in cars, specifically in the second precinct, the Marcy Holmes section, the highest concentration in the eastern part of that, or the Dinkytown area. Again, motor vehicle thefts, or theft from motor vehicles, I'm sorry, in the second precinct, the leading factor, and that is going to be the catalytic converter thefts. And you can go to the next slide, please. This will be our third precinct, violent crime. Up 42% from 2019. And again, when you look at the 4-year average or over 5 years, it's up 28%. This is consistent with citywide trends when you look at the aggravated assaults, the robberies, and the homicide. And when you look at 3rd precinct and then also, well, actually all the precincts where you in this category of aggravated assault, robbery, and homicide, we know that gun violence is really driving a good portion of that. And then when you look further at the robbery, what is driving some of that is also the recent trend of this carjacking, which I'll speak to later in the presentation. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So year to date, meaning since last year, it's up 3.5%, and the 4-year average, we're up 21%. From a property crimes perspective, burglaries that have been listed, and the increase there is really related to looting. This is seen across most of the city. Much of it was related to looting that occurred during the latter part of May and June during the civil unrest. Theft from motor vehicles at an increase again, and that's consistent with the citywide trends related to catalytic converter thefts. Another common theme on the auto thefts is going to be that keys are being left in their vehicles. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. 4th precinct violent crime is up 21% compared to last year and up 14% when compared to the previous 4 years. Again, both trending in the same direction. One of the anomalies here is that their robberies are actually slightly down, somewhat in the 4th precinct. But the other 2 categories that are driving the overall violent crimes up would be aggravated assault and homicide. And both of the subsets of that involve gun type violence. And go ahead and go to the next slide, please. There's been an increase in property crimes for the 4th precinct of 7% since last year. And then overall, when you look at 4-year trend, it's down by a little over 6%, 6.4%. So again, that would be a not consistent trend that we're seeing citywide. You can flip to the next slide, please. 5th precinct, violent crimes are up 41% year to date from last year, and then 46% over the last 4 years. So consistent when you look at the 4-year trend line. Again, all of these categories with the highest increases is what is really driving that increase in violent crimes overall, much due to the gun violence and also the influx of the carjacking that's been taking place citywide. Can you flip to the next slide, please? And we're going to look at 5th precinct property crimes. Most notable here is, I guess it would be the increase in burglaries. They're occurring in common areas of the apartments around the uptown area and along the Greenway. This was also something that was noted again in the 1st precinct from a burglary perspective. Let's see what else we have. Looting, again, much like the other precincts, was seen during the time of civil unrest in late May and June. And then another thing that we believe is driving the burglary significant increase is residential burglaries that involve porches and garages. You can go to the next screen here. So that's it for the data splash and kind of a rough analytics. And that was a very high level look at it. I didn't dive very deep into a lot of the particulars. It was just to give everybody an idea of what we look at. When you look at that total picture and what comes out of that, there's 2 driving factors that we believe are causing the violence, and it's gun violence or crimes associated with guns, and then the carjackings and the robberies, which at times can also involve guns. So they're all interrelated. So I'm not sure if you wanted me to pause there, Chair Cunningham, and we can ask some questions. I also have present with me our crime analyst, Austin Rice and Scott Wolfert. So if there's questions specifically about data, I'll probably defer to them.
Great, thank you, Commander. I really appreciate it. We do have a question from Councilmember Gordon.
Yeah, first of all, I really appreciate all this information and all the work that you do. So we could probably use 10 of you to really dig in and understand this. So I appreciate it greatly. I just kind of had a general question about the data that we're collecting and if it gives us a complete picture about it. because I've certainly been looking at the number of various crimes for years now. Also, I'm wondering if we're tracking how it works with population, because I know sometimes we'll get some data and some information that talks about how many certain crimes per 100,000, 10,000, and I know our population's been growing consistently, I think, for the last 10 years. Now, maybe we're seeing a change now. Do you guys track that very much? And do you think that's something relevant that we should care about and be aware of, or could help us better understand exactly what's going on? Obviously, if our population dropped dramatically and crime dropped, but it increased per capita, it would be a bad thing. You understand what I'm saying?
I think so. I think proportionality is one of the things that you're speaking to, and I think it's not anything that I'm prepared to discuss in depth today, but I know we look at population and, you know, the crime rate, not necessarily per capita, but it's something that we could look at for sure to see if it's proportional with what our population is. So as populations increase, has crime increased? Is that something, is it a factor? We could look at that.
It would definitely be much easier if that's something we were getting from the FBI and through normal reports. So I'm not expecting, I mean, I think it could give some interesting information. I was kind of curious on your take on it, and it sounds like it's not something we track regularly or consistently, but information we might have access to.
I think that's fair to say. And I think one of the things that makes it a little bit challenging is many times the suspects or the victims are from outside the jurisdiction of Minneapolis. So capturing that from a population perspective and trying to figure that out and how that's skewed can be challenging when you try to report out on something like that.
Well, thanks for sharing your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We do have Council President Bender joining us. Welcome, Council President, and I see that you're in queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for letting me attend. I'm not on the committee, but very interested in this topic and really appreciate this team's work. I think you probably have a lot to tell us beyond the numbers. I was also curious about a few things. One, I was very struck by the concentration of homicides in the city. It looks like 74% of homicides are in the two precincts, Precinct 3 and Precinct 4. And so, I mean, we've seen big percentage increases in some of the other precincts, like the 5th precinct where I represent, but the numbers are relatively small. You know, every single homicide is unacceptable and we want to prevent every single one. But we're looking at a shift from 3 to 6 in the 5th precinct, but, you know, it looked like 54 of the homicides were in those two precincts. So I just wondered, I was also curious about just what that tells us about resources, about strategy. Like I said, like you just mentioned, a lot of folks are coming in from outside the city, either victims or perpetrators. So it's not necessarily 100% correlated with who's living in a place or the population density or some of those other factors. But I just wondered if there was anything more you wanted to tell us about that geography piece.
Sure. I think what it tells us is that that's definitely where that type of crime is occurring. And from a resource perspective, that's where we would want to put different types of police resources, whether it's uniform patrol. And I speak to that a little bit as we go into the next few slides. So whether it's uniform police response, whether it's investigative response, whether it's working with Office of Violence Prevention to do some type of outreach in that area. And I'll let Director Cotton speak to what they do. But I think it points us in a direction, so to speak. And it also tells us that if we look deeper into that, which I'm not prepared to speak at length today, but we could at some other point. If you look at the makeup of the victims of the murders and certainly of the shootings, how many of those are from outside the jurisdiction would be telling. So it's not just people who live in that area, they're certainly affected, and that's not to diminish what they're experiencing, but it's to say that for whatever reason, that's an area that that type of activity occurs.
That's super helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Council President, and thank you, Commander, for that. I do also have Council Member Fletcher in queue. Council Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for this presentation. I think it's really helpful to have a baseline sort of common set of facts for us to work with. And obviously the way we present data it impacts the way we tell the story about what's happening in our city. So I think it's important to dig into this and to look at it, in a few different ways. And I guess one year to date is really helpful for showing long-term trends and for showing sort of, what the, like you said, adjusting for peaks that have happened over time. I'm also interested in, and I was just looking at month to date to kind of see seasonal changes and trends in terms of just, where things are happening within the year, because it's not as though things are uniformly up all the time, right? Like there's been surges and peaks within the data, as we look at where things are happening. And so there's it looks like broadly, there's significantly less violent crime and some less property crime in November for the first 18 days than there was in the first 18 days of October or September or July or August. And so I guess I'm curious, and that makes sense seasonally, right? Like that's usually the story that we hear about how crime trends typically work in Minneapolis is that when winter comes, when it starts to get colder, there's changes in those crime patterns. But I guess I'm wondering if you're looking at sort of how you're feeling broadly about trends as someone who spends a lot of time with this data, and if there are any particular kinds of crime, particularly I'm interested obviously in the gun violence and the things that you're really focusing in on that seem to be running contrary to those trends. Are there things that rather than decelerating as we get into winter months seem to be running contrary to that trend or accelerating, or are there things that we should be looking at in the way crime is organizing itself over time?
Sure, I think I'll address that in the next couple slides related to guns, but we do look at, so as a general source of measurement, as a starting point, we look at that year-long and then the 4-year. What we do look actually day to day and then week by week for those spikes and those anomalies that occur that might not show up just by looking at that year-long trend. So I should have maybe clarified that at the start of the presentation. But yeah, I think to your point, I'll demonstrate that generally we've seen that downward trending or flattening of the curve for crime in general, but there is a little bit of an anomaly that isn't consistent with the historical activity surrounding guns that we're not seeing this year, but we've seen in other years.
Thank you for that. And, I'll just briefly add that, and this is a little bit higher level, but when we look at this sort of data, Council President Bender spoke to this a little bit, that, in some areas you see significant percentage increase, but in comparison to other parts of the city, that those numbers are still relatively low. And I think that one of the things I just want to speak to more high level as we're having this discussion, and this isn't necessarily for you, but more broadly as we're having this discussion, is that, the 4th Precinct, we experience a high, we've always experienced a concentration of gun violence. And even if the percentage isn't as high as other parts of the city, the number is still the highest. And I think that it's just that that level of violence has been considered normalized in other parts of the city. And so I just really don't want that to get lost in the percentage increase as we're looking at that. I just also want to say, Commander, I really appreciate the way you have presented this information. I think it's easily digestible for folks to be able to, and accessible, and we're creating a baseline here for folks to be able to see and understand what's happening in our city in the realm of public safety. So thank you for that. And I don't have anybody else in queue, so the floor is yours again.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So this is really a little bit of regurgitation of the data, and a little bit more on the analysis part, and then we'll go into the response part. So this is pretty much a snapshot of what we call gun crime activity, and this is just year to date. So it's to give us a snapshot and an idea, and we know that gun violence has been definitely trending upward, and it's unprecedented levels for 2020. But when you look at these numbers, there's a couple things on this slide that I'll point out that are real indicators of the veracity of the gun violence. So the first part is shooting-related incidents. And what that means is those are CAD-generated or 911 calls that are around actual shootings, a shooting report only, or ShotSpotter activations. So you can see there's an incredible percent increase in there. There's 4,000, roughly 4,000 last year. Nearly 9,000 this year, so dramatic change. Then when you go down to the ShotSpotter activations, and all these are consistent, right? There's increases in everything. And so you go from 1,600 to 3,800. But one of the most, I think, interesting numbers for me to look at as far as the gun violence or the activity is the recovered shell casings, or DCCs, what we call them. So these are casings that are recovered generally at shooting scenes, or if a call comes in for a discharged weapon, officers respond and there's evidence left over. So in 2019, there was roughly 2,400. In this year, there's 5,600. So that's a significant amount of shell casings that are recovered. Now, the vast majority of those come after officers respond to what's known as a ShotSpotter call, where there's an activation that's captured by a device that says there's gunfire in a certain part of the city. And so I think that shows me that there's a lot of activity, a lot of shooting going on. Those aren't necessarily specific incidents. There's multiple rounds being fired at each one of these incidents. The next one is recovered firearms were up compared to where we were last year. And what that tells me is that our officers are out there continuing to do the work that they've done in previous years. And the approaches that we're taking are at least meeting what we did last year and then exceeding that. And so I think that's a good thing. That's a success. The second to the bottom, the ATF NIBIN hits, that's the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. And so that's a program that we've been involved with the city, or with the ATF for a number of years, since the mid-2000s easily. And what this does is this forensically links a firearm and or spent shell casings to different incidents or different scenes historically. So it can be within that year or it can be in previous years. So it helps us to understand better where that gun has been, or the people involved may be similar. And the gunshot wound victims speaks for itself, a dramatic increase from 235 to 507.
Commander, if I may just add a little bit of context. So we expanded the ShotSpotter system at the beginning of this year. When did we expand the ShotSpotters? Do you know off the top of your head?
I do not know off the top of my head, but I think where you're going with that is it only covers certain parts of the city. So it generally covers the 3rd and the 4th precinct, or parts of that.
Yeah, because I know that we expanded it in my ward to some neighborhoods that had not previously been covered by ShotSpotter. And so, I was just thinking that also, since there's more ShotSpotters, that there would be more ShotSpotter activations as a result of that. Is that correct?
I'd have to look at the date that we expanded it. I don't know that it was this year, but I can dig into that a little bit. But yeah, to the point, if we did expand it, that would explain that, one of the reasons why there might be more ShotSpotter activations.
I think we expanded it at the beginning of this year, if I'm not mistaken, but let's double check because I'm just curious about how that would influence this particular data. Just a little nitpicky, but I just wanted to figure out what the context was for that. I do see we have Councilmember Fletcher in queue as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, with a similar clarification. Commander, did I hear you correctly that the ShotSpotter activations are included in the shooting-related incidents number above, or are those separated out? They are.
Yeah. They are.
And so if an incident, let's say, generated a ShotSpotter activation and also a call to 911 from a neighbor, would it likely appear as twice in that data, or do we typically connect those up so that they're counted once as a single incident?
They're generally combined through the CAD data, correct? Computer-aided dispatch.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And just for the record, for maybe some folks who are new to this conversation, what does ATF mean?
Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. It's a federal agency that we partner with.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Just want to make sure we hear it on the record. So thank you. The floor is yours again.
Okay, so that covers that slide. We can flip to the next slide. So what we did here is we looked at by a 2-week period, and this was what's going to get towards, I think it was Councilmember Fletcher who was talking about the downward trends that are generally considered seasonal. So when we look at gunshot wound victims, what we've seen when we look back over the years, it generally flattens or decreases in the latter part of the year, specifically late fall, early winter. However, this year what we're seeing is that although there was a small dip, it's not only is it elevated from all other years, it's still continuing to trend upward. So that is inconsistent with what we've seen historically. Now, that may change as you said, we look at these things weekly, so it may dramatically decrease and then enter into a flattened graph, but it's still different than historically what it's been. You can flip to the next slide. So at first glance, this is a fairly complicated looking document, and when I first saw it, when Austin Rice created, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. So it's really comparing our gunshot wound victims by day from last year to this year, and it does two things really. It shows us gunshot wound victims, but it also starts to go into the area of staffing and resource draw. So when you look at the top and the bottom, I'll refer to it as positive and negative space. Positive in this instance is uncolored, so clear, and the negative being colored where there's a gunshot wound victim. So clearly we know this in 2019, there was less. In 2020, there's more. So that's fairly easy, that's simple logic. What's interesting about this is when you look at the bottom portion of this slide, you'll see much more blocking of consistent days in which there was a gunshot wound victim. And you'll also see an increase in the yellow and red, which indicates multiple victims on any one given day. And so not only are there more shootings, there's more shootings involving multiple victims. The difference being, I believe they're proportional to the increase in the overall gunshot wound victims. So, you know, and then when you look at this from a resource perspective, we know that this type of response is resource heavy, so it requires a lot of resources. In 2019, there was fewer. In 2020, there's more. Using simple logic, it just means on those days where there's multiple shootings occurring with multiple victims, it's going to be a longer and more impactful draw on our resources, and that's occurring for multiple days in a row, which has become more of a common in 2020, and in 2019 that would not have been a common trend. You can go to the next slide, please. So what are we doing about it is one of the questions that was posed, and I think when you consider law enforcement, there's two real functions of law enforcement, or not functions, but categories of law enforcement. You have patrol, so uniformed response, and then you have investigations. So this first slide really speaks to what patrol is generally doing now. This is very high level, so there's a lot more detail that each one of the precinct inspectors could speak to. But in general, these are the types of things that we've been doing and we continue to do in response to gun violence. So we provide a uniform patrol response related to the sound of shots fired, shootings, and the shot spotter activations. And again, because there's so many more, that is a draw on resources. We know that in the hour or 2 hours after a shooting, that's the most intensive time for those resources to be tied up. And so we also deploy officers in areas experiencing an increase or static reporting of gun-related crimes. So to Chair Cunningham's point about the north side always having that higher level of gun violence persistent, and the same down in 3rd Precinct. So those historical hotspots of where that's occurring, we deploy officers to that area when they're not taking other types of calls. We ask them to be in those areas. We also leverage community relationships to impact the individuals participating in gun violence. We do that through the Office of Violence Prevention. I know I've been working with Director Cotton for over the past 3.5 years in the different roles that I've held with the department. Again, I'll let her speak to that, but each one of the inspectors and the lieutenants, the sergeants, the officers, they all have unique relationships within the community that they try to leverage in order to get an idea, number one, of who's involved in the violence, but also what can be done about it. And then also on the precinct level, the inspectors have the flexibility of using what's known as a community response team or certain investigations, and those are plainclothes officers that sometimes they're in uniform, sometimes they're in plainclothes, but they really do follow-up investigations and or are used in specific areas where the precinct inspector thinks they'll be the most impactful. Go to the next slide. So on the investigation side of the coin, we're coordinating investigations that are being conducted by units within the Violent Crimes Division. So Commander Adams is in charge of that division. And there's 3 primary units that are conducting the follow-up investigations. And what he does is he manages and coordinates the different types where there may be similar people involved. So trying to get information sharing to help with successful adjudication of the cases. We're also incorporating the use of forensic evidence as much as we can into the shooting and gun-related investigations, and that's related to the NIBIN hits, or the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. And that can be helpful when we're trying to look for commonalities that wouldn't otherwise present themselves. Again, we coordinate with the Office of Violence Prevention on topics centered around the GVI model. Lieutenant St. George is our main department liaison that works with Director Cotton and her group. We also have part of my division, the uniformed part of my division that works with the Office of Violence Prevention. And then the last one here, really in the first part of July, the chief made the decision to create what's the Strategic Operations Division. That's what I'm in charge of. What we do is really work on conducting enhanced gun investigations. We use data, we use analytics to focus very specifically on people or groups that we believe have demonstrated the most willingness to participate in violence across the city. And then we also coordinate with the other units in the department who do similar type investigative activities. So it'd be the CERT teams in the precincts. We also have a great partner with the ATF. They have 6 or 7 agents that are assigned to our division that help us bridge that gap between the state and the federal system when we're presenting cases for prosecution. Let me go to the next slide. Some tactics that we use from an investigative side, I won't bore you with reading through them, but there's 3 main types of investigations that occur. It's reactive, proactive, and then part of proactive investigations would be a focused enforcement detail, which as we speak, there's one going on today. And so the reactive is a traditional where crimes have been reported. It'll be assigned for investigation. Investigators do their due diligence and work through the information that they have, collect additional information, and then ultimately try to present that case to the county for charging or to the federal prosecuting office if it meets that threshold. A proactive investigation is a little bit more unique. That's where you take a step back and you look at who are the people that we believe are most likely involved in violence. And sometimes we coordinate with sources of information. We look at data for sure, our RMS system, so our records management system, to figure out, who has a high frequency of contact with police. And then as part of that, those are more one-off investigations. And then as part of that, this division has really worked on conducting these focused enforcement details. And what that is using a larger amount of law enforcement resources. We partner with other agencies. Hennepin County Sheriff's Offices frequently joined us. We coordinate the activities with the CERT teams, and we plan for certain areas, certain individuals or groups that we'll focus on for that day. And let's see, we have the next slide.
Actually, Commander, if I can jump in right quick, and if
Sure.
we go back to the last slide. Do we have data, particularly for the reactive, the traditional investigations? Do we have what the clearance rates are for homicide in particular? Do you know that? Sorry to put you on the spot with that. I'm just curious if
No, that's okay. It's a question that's been asked before, and it's something that I could get and look for you, but it's really depending on, the clearance rate is a tricky question in my mind, because it's really, what is it that you're asking? Are you asking if somebody was arrested, or are you asking if somebody was charged and fully prosecuted or adjudicated? And so I think if there's two different questions, so defining what clearance rate means is one of the first, I think, stops in that question, but that's definitely something that I could look at and coordinate with Commander Adams for sure.
Thank you for that differentiation. I would definitely lean more towards who has actually been charged. So because the idea is like the quality of investigations, as well as and the reason why I ask is because the most indicative factor in whether or not somebody is going to shoot and kill someone is if they've already done it. And so, it's like, if we're able to get some of these folks off this, if we're able to get folks off who are doing this off the streets and actually getting them charged and held accountable, then that really makes a difference. Can you, so thank you for that. And I'll follow up so maybe we can get some more information, because it's just a question that I've had and just wondering about. Can you just talk a little bit more about what your focused enforcement detail, you gave a good overview, but can you dig a little bit more into that? Like, when is that deployed, and what does that operation look like? Because you had mentioned in partnership with Hennepin County. So can you explain a little bit more of what that looks like operationally?
Sure. So it's the focused enforcement detail is really something that I would make a determination if we're going to do or not. It's mainly brought forward by the investigators who work day to day in that world, and it's presented as an overview as far as what group we may be focusing on for the day. The specific tactics that we use, I'm not prepared to talk about today. There's nothing overtly secret about what we do, but it's generally using plainclothes officers along with uniformed patrol to operate in certain areas of the city that we know are being affected by the gun violence, and we believe that we know some of the people who may be involved in that. So we focus on that for a specific day, and it helps when we can have our partnering agencies come with us, because it's a force multiplier. So when we're doing these types of activities, it's resource intensive, and so if we stop one person, that may result in several officers being tied up for an hour or two. So having that additional support from our partners is helpful, because we can continue on with our operation for the day.
Thank you so much. I really do appreciate that. I don't have any other questions, and no one's in queue, so please continue.
So this next slide is a good demonstration of if we're in the right areas doing the right things. So when you look on the left, this is a heat map basically of where guns have been recovered as evidence in 2020. And when you look on the right, this is where our gunshot wound victim locations are. So not only are we in pretty much the same exact areas where we're recovering our guns, much of which are through proactive investigations, and then with patrol continuing to do their work with traffic stops and suspicious vehicle stops, but it also expands a little bit out from the borders of those gunshot wound locations. So we're in the peripheral of where those hotspots for victims are, which to me shows we're in the right areas doing the right things, especially when you combine that with the numbers of guns that we've been recovering. We're on the right track as far as what we're doing. Go to the next slide. So this is a guns recovered by the week in comparison to last year. And, you know, the weeks on the bottom are by what we call our Code 4 weeks or MSTAT weeks. And again, what this shows me is just that although we had a dip there, probably midsummer, what we're doing is where we're trending is up. And that's a good thing. So what we're doing is we're doing the right thing. Again, when you overlay this with the heat maps, we're continuing to recover guns in the areas that we believe are being affected the most by gun violence. You can flip to the next slide. So as part of this, getting back to what the data and the analysis originally showed us during the first part of the presentation, it was kind of bifurcated in the sense that it was gun violence, and then a subset or a different section of that would be robberies and carjacking. So the carjackings is really a more recent emerging trend that we've seen, and it's a significant trend, and it's been widely reported on. So in 2019, there was 83 what we call carjackings, and of note, that's not a criminal offense. So a carjacking really is a type of robbery that occurs. And so we've been working with the city IT and internally with trying to parse those out of it so we can better track that. So last year, 83 what we call carjackings occurred, with the hotspots being in Bloomington Avenue and Lake Street in the 3rd precinct, and then Falwell Park in the 4th precinct. This year, you can see there's a dramatic increase with the largest clusters of these occurring in the 3rd and 5th precinct. Of note, many of the vehicles are being recovered and or contacted by way of a traffic stop from a uniformed officer in the 4th precinct. And I think that's that speaks to itself as far as the issues that we've been seeing as of late. We also believe that a good portion of these are being facilitated or perpetrated by a smaller group of people as opposed to just random perpetrators engaging in this type of activity. So you can flip to the next. So what are we doing in response to this? Again, this is more of an emerging trend. So on the investigation side, really coordinating investigative resources and follow-up between the robbery unit and juvenile investigations. The robbery unit mainly handles all adult suspects, and then the juvenile investigations obviously handles juveniles. So those two units working together will help in identifying similar suspects and or similar trends. Streamlining investigation assignments, so when there are connections made, they're assigned to the same either group or investigator. Using analytics of incident trend data to identify common geographic areas where vehicles are being recovered and or stolen. So that really does two things. It helps the investigators try to determine suspect or suspect groups, but it also helps patrol know where to send, when available, high visibility patrols. And then, of course, we're partnering with surrounding agencies to share intelligence and analysis. So when they cross jurisdictions, it's not some random surprise that this person or this group of people was doing the similar crime in one city. Now they're crossing into another city. So we're really trying to work good with our surrounding agencies to give them a heads up as to what we know, and then likewise they share what they know.
Commander, I have a question or comment from Council President Bender.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you mentioned, this has been an issue in the 5th precinct, which includes Ward 10. I just wanted to note that we had a presentation related to this morning at the Criminal Justice Coordinating Committee, which is a partnership between the city, Hennepin County and then suburban law enforcement and social service agencies, and focus specifically on this issue because so many of these carjackings are perpetrated by juveniles, as far as we understand, and going back to 2019, it sounds like the same group or related youth, in groups and networks, really involved in a lot of these incidents. And so it sounds like law enforcement in Minneapolis is facing a lot of the same challenges that we heard from suburban law enforcement today. Just, the youth are known, they've often been arrested, they've perhaps had services from Hennepin County, and sometimes multiple times, and just that approach so far hasn't been able to either really get the family what they need and get the youth on track, or interrupt these cycles of harm that the kids are causing in the community, which is not acceptable. So, there were some specific recommendations coming out of that, a lot of which focused on the violence prevention side. There was a piece about information sharing, which I think is really important, and I'm glad you highlighted it here because, I know that maybe Director Cotton will talk about this more, that our violence prevention efforts have been focused on a group that's a little older than the kids that are primarily focused in carjackings or primarily doing the carjackings, who are super young. But that we have some models that we could deploy to intervene, and even some existing violence interrupters that are on staff now and contract with the city that could help do additional outreach, who know some of the kids involved. So I just want to highlight this issue, just appreciate the work. And this feels like a place where we don't quite have all of these partnerships and systems aligned at the city and in law enforcement generally within the county, as well as with that service side, and our resource in the Office of Violence Prevention. So you can take that as a comment, or if you had anything else to add. I think this work to really hone in on these trends and understand the patterns has been really helpful.
I'll go ahead and just add something as well, a couple of thoughts as well. First, I'm interested in general for us to dig into carjackings and juvenile justice and where those two things overlap at a future Public Health and Safety Committee, because it's a big topic of conversation in our city. It is an emerging issue, and so I think that would be very good for the public to be able to be a part of this conversation and to create transparency. And I also just want to point out that the data, I brought forward a staff direction around addressing gun violence, particularly focused around group and gang involved folks, particularly young people in North Minneapolis. And what this data really shows is that there's a clear connection between what activity is happening here in North Minneapolis and how that is spilling over into other parts of the city, with being able to see and have an understanding that carjackings are happening in South Minneapolis, but the cars are being recovered in North Minneapolis. So I just want to point out that data. I think that's a really important point, because when we think about interventions, when we think about deploying resources or investing new resources, thinking about where is it, or what's actually the origin, that data is really helpful. So I just want to say thank you for bringing that, because we can deduct it, at least as a Northside Council member. I've been I feel pretty clear that this is what we're seeing and hearing on the ground, is that young folks are perpetrating crimes in other parts of the city, both amongst one another, but also at following older adults who are also group and gang involved. And so So, I think this data is just really important for my colleagues to be able to see. So when we're thinking about how are we investing resources to think intentionally about where do we actually disrupt it at its origins. So just wanted to point that out. Thank you for that point of information. I have a question or comment from Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair Cunningham. I wonder if you can give us, Commander, any detail about arrests that have been made in relationship to this trend. So, to the extent that we're engaged in these efforts, are we making arrests as we find these cars, and are we apprehending people? Are we disrupting this activity, or are these is this a response that's still kind of working to take flight?
No, I can say that we're definitely making arrests related to the carjackings, and we've identified groups of people that we think are prolifically more involved than others in this type of activity. The other thing that we know is that the people that have been engaging in this most recent pattern of carjackings are using that as a mode to go to other areas and commit similar type crimes. So it's not just a one-off, it's not a carjacking down in 5th Precinct. That carjacking in 5th Precinct may spill over into 2nd Precinct and then into 3rd Precinct and then ultimately end in 4th Precinct or something to that sense. I don't have any specific numbers as far as the numbers of people that we've arrested. I can definitely look into that and communicate it back to you or explore that further. I know Chair Cunningham mentioned something about exploring this further in a different meeting. So as that information comes in and we work with our partners over in the county in streamlining some of these investigations and trying to make the investigations perhaps a little bit more fruitful as far as a charging perspective goes, that's something that we could discuss later.
Great, thank you. And then just to follow up on Councilmember Cunningham's question about origins or observation about origins, one of the questions that I've had, especially in relationship to the gun violence, because I occasionally hear people make what seem like maybe unfounded claims about groups coming in from other cities or other kinds of activity. And so I guess I'm curious, what are you finding, and do you track where people live when there's a gun violence incident, or when you do apprehend somebody, and are you finding that these crimes are being committed by people with driver's licenses from other states, or is this people from our community committing this violence, or could you characterize the mix? Because I think that matters in terms of our community response, right? In terms of relationships and who do we have the potential to do, other kinds of community response with if people are rooted in our community.
Sure. So I know we've looked at that type of information before when we've looked at some of our data points. I don't have that with me today. It's definitely something that we could look at. I think one of the things to keep in mind is generally that type of information is what's reported to us. So when you mentioned tracking it, we have that information, but it's stuff that we've collected and maintained in our records management system. So if there's a suspect who we know has an address listed on their driver's license as this, or that's what they happen to give us, we're relying on that as truth or fact. And so keeping that in mind when diving into that type of a look, it's something to, it's just a factor to consider, but it's definitely something that we could look at doing related to gunshot wound victims and suspects.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for that information as well. I'll just say that one of the frustrations we have over in North Minneapolis is that we have folks who come in from the suburbs or other parts, mostly the suburbs, who will come to North Minneapolis because to engage in criminal behavior because they feel they can get away with it here. So that is a challenge that we definitely experience over here, as well as challenges that are actually rooted in our community. So I see Council President Bender is in queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know we have other things to cover today. I think it'd be great if we could also ask some of the folks from the county who are involved in this issue to perhaps even publicly come present and share some of the work they've been doing on this issue. Because, you know, there's the law enforcement piece, which is one part of it, but I know a number of arrests have been made, and there's just a question about how do we meet multiple goals. I know the county has been working really hard to try to do diversion programs and more supportive approach for juvenile offenders so that we're not incarcerating young people, many of which have been really effective at reducing recidivism and getting all of the outcomes that we want, including reducing community harm. And also we know there's a small group of young people, you know, that those systems aren't working so far and likely need a different kind of intervention. So yeah, so I think for the follow-up, it'd be nice to hear from kind of that breadth of the system.
Agreed. Thank you. We'll definitely be sure to include them as we are exploring this conversation deeper at a future public health and safety meeting. That's all we have in queue. Commander, do you have any other slides for us today?
No, I believe that's the last slide, and I'm assuming there'll probably be some feedback as to the content. So I look forward to hearing that from you, Mr. Chair, and then the other council members. And if there's anything that we can provide in a little bit more detail that's publicly available, we'll certainly work at getting that to you.
Great. Thank you again for this presentation. As the chair who set up wanting to have these monthly presentations, this was great work, being able to really answer the questions that the council members have, as well as our constituents throughout the city. So thank you for your service. Thank you for all that you've done to pull this together. And I look forward to continuing engaging with you moving forward.
You're welcome.
Great, thank you. So next up, we have Director Sasha Cotton from the Office of Violence Prevention to help give us an overview of what the OVP has been doing in response to some of the data that we saw today. So welcome, Director Cotton.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Sir Chair and Council, for having us. We will try to get through our slides relatively quickly because we do have guest presenters on the back end from Cure Violence, but we do want to give some updates about Office of Violence Prevention and its work. Could we go to the next slide, please? So first and foremost, we wanted to give some highlights about the Transforming Community Safety. This slide is really focused on background. As we've mentioned in prior presentations, we're really anchoring the work in a 3-pillar approach, those being alternatives to police and police response, 911 calls, and that work is really being led by our coordinator's office and the innovation team. The public health-oriented violence prevention work is coming out of the Office of Violence Prevention, and then policy reform and continuing to shift police culture is coming out of MPD and our mayor's office. This work really started in late September and continues to evolve. Next slide, please. Some updates as it pertains to this work. We have now a full-time staff person who has been detailed from the city to serve as a project manager working out of the Office of Violence Prevention, which has been a great asset in helping to move this work along quickly. We have just since last month been able to launch a community input survey on reimagining public safety. It is currently available in English, Spanish, Somali, Hmong, and Oromo. The survey is really just the first step of engagement. And through this survey, community members are able to share their vision about what they'd like to see in a new model of public safety. The results from this survey will be used to help us create some recommendations and will be used for further steps in community engagement. I do want to note that the first round of surveys will be pulling the data from those tomorrow. So we strongly encourage folks who want their input to be captured in this first pull to go ahead and fill out the survey between today and close of business tomorrow. And if they do end up completing after tomorrow, that information will still be gathered. It just will be used for future input moving into the next round of engagement. And I also just want to take a moment to name some of the community, the city departments that have been really helpful. This is certainly an enterprise effort. And so to the staff in the Office of Violence Prevention and the Health Department's research team, the coordinator's office, NCR, MPD, the mayor's office, lots of folks, and to the council, lots of folks have been involved in this across the enterprise. And so it has made doing the work in a way that I think we're really proud of thus far since we've been able to really dig in starting in September. Next slide, please. So we've got a high-level overview of Next Step. I won't go into an explanation about exactly what the program does because we've certainly reviewed that at previous council meetings, but this is our hospital-based work. The updates are that year to date, they've served 128 people. Participants from July through September in our last presentation were 48, and new intakes in October were at 12. And I think the highlights that are new for this update are really the importance of a newly formed young women's group. It's open to the public. It's meeting right now on a monthly basis, and hopefully we'll be able to do it on a more frequent basis. But with COVID restrictions, trying to sort of navigate that is a little bit challenging. But the goal is really to allow, in an open to the public way, young women who have experienced violence, whether that's as perpetrators, victims, or secondary victims, to have a safe space to really do some skill building, get some trauma response and support from trained people in mental health and trauma response, but also to really build community amongst those who are navigating this shared experience. And so it has been going well. We've had a couple of sessions now, and we've seen anywhere from 20 to 30 young women and girls attend. And so we're looking forward to what this can bring about as we continue to roll that out. Next slide, please. Project Life, or the Group Violence Intervention. Again, I won't jump too deep into the details of how the program works. I think the high level overview of what we're seeing that is trend and noteworthy is a real reemergence of past participants. So in this program, we don't have a time limit on how long a person should be served. We really think about it as a cycle. People, will have deeper needs at some points in their journey and may taper off as they get more established and are gaining skills and getting transitioned to employment and housing and stabilized. They may need less support. And we're seeing a number of our past participants who had really been stabilized and kind of at a distance from the program, not needing as much service, show back up and really have deep needs in this last month or two. And they're largely reporting that that's as a result of losing jobs because of COVID, and certainly their concerns about deep increases in violence and wanting to do the best that they can to get services so that they can not be pulled into that realm. And so we're appreciative for the ability to continue to work with those people and that they have a place to come back to and get both social service support, but also that mentorship that our case management provides. It's also not noted here, but GVI has had 13 new participants enroll in the program since the beginning of October. October 1 to October 31st, those are the numbers. Next slide, please. And Committee Chair Cunningham, as he had mentioned before, did give a staff direction to really do a deeper dive and enhance our GVI work, specifically in response to some of the increased violence on the north side. That work is underway in partnership with the Minneapolis Promise Zone, the Office of Violence Prevention, and the Minneapolis Police Department. We've been working with stakeholders to really identify those who are at greatest risk. That's a part of our ongoing work, but really taking a moment to do a deeper dive. And the data has certainly helped us to identify that some of the increases we're seeing are with a younger demographic. We have, in many ways, in the Office of Violence Prevention, been working with what trend had shown us in previous years, which was a deep need to work with folks 18 to 25, roughly, sometimes a little older. But we're certainly seeing trends that indicate we need to be doing more with young people under the age of 18. And as a result of that, we're working in partnership with Minneapolis Public Schools and Hennepin County Juvenile and Young Adult Probation, and are really trying to dig deeper into developing a juvenile arm of GVI that would not be as heavy on the law enforcement side as a typical GVI implementation, but would really look at doubling down on service provision and trying to make sure that we're doing everything that we can for young people that we believe might be at great risk for being involved with violence, whether that's as a, the victimization and perpetration is so circular that we just really want to get in front of it and minimize that retaliatory violence, minimize the trauma. And so we're eager to develop this and have some feelers out for case management opportunities, and are already beginning to work with some families. I know that a number of young people who have been identified at this point have already been served. Some of them have even been relocated to keep them safe. And so we feel like we're moving in the right direction, although there certainly is still a lot of work to do. Next slide, please. The Minneapolis strategic outreach work, which we're working in partnership with Cure Violence, who you'll hear from a little bit later, to build out, was piloted this fall. We continue to have some teams out, but I know there's been some media coverage that we are sidelining our interrupters, and that is certainly some miscommunication, we believe. Our pilot program has always intended to modify the amount of time our outreach workers spent doing street outreach starting in November because of weather, but also because we really want to take the latter half of the year to do some evaluation and training, but be mindful of the weather. It is typical that many outreach teams reduce the number of hours that they spend doing street outreach during those winter months, just because in Minnesota, our weather does not allow for that level of outdoor engagement. And young people and those at great risk are not necessarily spending as much time outside for them to be engaged with. What it has really brought to light is that we certainly need space where our interrupters can bring people and engage with them indoors in privacy. And so that's something we'll be looking to address in 2021. This pilot was stood up really quickly and functioned as a timely and visible peace presence to provide resources in the community and to address some of the immediate concerns around violence. Next slide, please. So as I had mentioned before, our pilot was always intended to generate and gather information and insight into what longer term, broader implementation could look like. And that's why we are taking some time to really do some evaluation, do some interviews with existing interrupters so that we can use that information as we work with Cure Violence International to develop our longer term strategy. It can be really difficult to implement at full capacity and thoughtfully plan at the same time. So that also accounts for some of the scaling back that people might be seeing. We do, as I mentioned, still have a limited number of outreach workers who are available and who are working on a modified schedule. So some teams are working 16 to 20 hours per week. We've got some who are really responding on an as needed basis, depending on the need in their specific area. And so, as I mentioned before, Cure Violence, who's a global program, is serving with us right now in doing some technical assistance and helping us to look at a site evaluation here on the ground. We're looking at a 4-phased implementation, the first of a few which can be done virtually, and then hopefully with COVID permitting, their team will be able to come to Minneapolis and really spend some time with us on the ground as we roll into 2021. Next slide, please. So that concludes my presentation. We are happy to take any questions about the presentation or about the work to date, but I also want to make sure that we give time to our guests from Cure Violence.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments from my colleagues related to this portion of the presentation? I'm not seeing any. I'll just say I'm excited about the Young Women's Group launching for Next Step. That's a desperately needed resource. So kudos to you and the team for helping to fill that gap. Really great job.
Thank you, Sir Chair. And I would just add with Next Step that there was some really great coverage from WCCO on the work that they're doing earlier this week. And so I would encourage folks to look that up and get a little bit more information about how the folks at Next Step are really helping to save and change lives.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So now I will pass it over to you so you can introduce our guests for today.
Yes, thank you, sir. We are excited to have Brent Decker and Kobe Williams from Cure Violence International here with us today. They have been the primary partners that we're working with from the organization. Kobe and some other frontline staff have been able to come up to Minneapolis earlier this summer, and we are so excited about the partnership and the ability to really look at all that they can help us with as we think about evidence-based models and rolling things out with a level of fidelity that allows us to evaluate and measure outcomes. And so I will let them do a deeper introduction of themselves and their work. So thank you, gentlemen, for being here and for all that you do.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brent Decker, and I'm the Chief Program Officer at Cure Violence Global. Unfortunately, Kobe Williams had to step off. We had our timing a little bit wrong in terms of when we were going to be presenting, so I apologize, but I will definitely brief him on any conversation that we have. You can go to the next slide. So essentially, Cure Violence Global was founded a bit over 20 years ago by a physician who had worked at the World Health Organization, and he had primarily worked first on tuberculosis and then on HIV/AIDS in Asia and Africa. And he came back to the US in the mid to late 90s when, kind of like now, we're seeing a big spike in many cities in terms of violence. And he thought and started to look at violence with a number of other physicians and other Institute of Medicine and the World Health Organization to really try and understand violence from a different lens and see what could public health, what could a health lens add to the conversation in terms of understanding violence? What could it add in terms of policy? And most importantly, what could it add in terms of practical programming to assist cities as part of their broader strategy to reduce violence at a community level? So if you go to the next slide. And as they were, as him and a number of other physicians were really looking at violence, really saw that violence behaves like a contagious disease. And about 20 some odd years ago, this was kind of a new idea, you know, and now I think it's pretty common to hear this notion of the epidemic of violence. And in the passing years, it has been adopted by, oh, I'm sorry, could you stay on the other slide? I don't know why it moved forward. Yeah, thank you. You know, that's really been understood in this way by institutions like I said, the Institute of Medicine, World Health Organization, CDC kind of comes back and forth on it, but it's really being understood as a contagious process. And in a sense, that was new information a decade or so ago. And if you could just go back, I don't know why it's, but what we found is that treating violence like an epidemic actually can get results in the community that we're working. So if you go to the next slide, we can finally move to it. Yeah, can you just hit it two more times? Sorry, there's a little animation on it. And so one final time. One more time, please. So essentially, when we think about violence as a contagion, it meets every other kind of character. It meets the same characteristics that other contagions have or other epidemics have, in that there's clustering. And so I think that you saw on the previous two presentations, this idea of clustering, both with the lead paint, right? We saw the map and we could kind of see where it was clustering across the city, as well as some of the homicides that we were just talking about. You know, there's this like clustering effect of it. So it's not uniformly distributed across the city or even a community at that, for that point. It has epidemic waves, like certain events can kick off epidemic waves where we see great increases rapidly. And this is true with a lot of other contagious processes. I mean, I think we're all kind of more versed in public health during this COVID pandemic right now, understanding kind of these notions of epidemic and epidemic waves. There's population characteristics, right? And so I think we heard in the other presentation about some carjacking, about violence in terms of it's not uniformly distributed across the population, that there seems to be some population characteristics. And finally, there's a mode of transmission, and all contagions, all epidemics have this kind of mode of transmission. And for us, this is really the important part of thinking about violence. And so if you can go to the next slide, please. The means of transmission for violence, really, I mean, if we think about cholera and other epidemics, you know, you might be ingesting something or a certain contraction of a virus through sexual behavior, but things of that nature. But when we think about violence, its mode of transmission is really through observing, witnessing, and experiencing trauma, right? And so the next slide we can go to it, that's fine. We don't have a ton of time. I mean, what we see and what has been able to be established is really there's been mapping out in terms of when people are exposed, experience, and see violence, it changes fundamentally how their brain reacts to their engagement with the world. And so this is like a smart version of how this is mapped out in the brain. But if you go to the next slide, you can go to the next slide, that's fine. I think this is a kind of easier thing to understand in terms of the means of transmission, right? And so you have the, and forgive the kind of antiquated nature of this, but I think it demonstrates it a little easier to understand, at least for me, than the brain circuit mapping, right? So you have the boss yelling at the employee coming home yelling at their significant other yelling at the kid, and then the kid yelling at the cat. And so we see a very similar pattern in terms of how this issue of violence and really all behaviors are transmitted. And so if you go to the next slide, and what we see in communities where violence is acute, there's many methods of exposure. So there's community, media, family, in the school, even some state-sanctioned violence. And what we see is that it can lead to, as the individual, depending on a number of kind of risk factors, is exposed to this, they then start to perpetrate violence. In the next slide here, we see the result in many communities that there's multiple exposures, and then our outcomes is that we see multiple events occurring, and it kind of goes on. And we kind of heard a little bit about this in some of the presentation of the data before. If you go to the next slide. All this in terms of what our founder and what the other physicians understood violence in this way is that it's good news. And it's good news, why? Because we know how to stop health epidemics. Not that it's easy, not that it's not super complicated, but basically we know how to do this. And if you go to the next slide, and it's really three things. So if you could hit the slide 2 more times, please. 1 more time, thank you. It's really 3 things. 1 is interrupting the transmission. 2 is preventing future spread. And 3 is changing group norms. And this is true with any epidemic we're working on. And so you see the idea of the interrupter really comes from the World Health Organization's idea of how to stop epidemics. So you can go to the next slide. And so the model that was built from these 3 things in epidemic control that's been replicated across the world has these 3 components of it, right? So we're interrupting the transmission, so we're mediating conflicts, we're keeping conflicts cool, we're preventing retaliation, reducing the highest risk, so we're preventing future spread, so we're accessing the highest risk. If you go back, I'm sorry, I don't know why it keeps on skipping ahead. Working on changing behavior, providing treatment, and then changing community norms. And so responding to shootings, organizing community, and spreading positive norms. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this interruption part, there are some interrupters already existing and working in Minneapolis. And so these are individuals who are credible, that are seen on your side, that kind of validate a person's concerns, but they're able, because of their relationship and because of their kind of understanding of what many young people and not so young people sometimes are going through, they're able to really kind of reframe some of the things and engage people in a way that others don't have the ability to do. And this is a very kind of fundamental concept in public health, right? In terms of really changing behaviors, right? Is that we really don't always admit it, but what our peers think about us really drive most of our behavior. And so we kind of capitalize on some of this in terms of using individuals that have credibility to talk to people in a way that is respectful, that is non-judgmental, to try and talk them down from acting violently, or if something does occur, preventing retaliation. And so these interrupters, there's a whole kind of strategy for recruitment, hiring, training, and then the whole issue of deployment and management of them. And so that's the first part of the model. If you go to the next slide. And like I said, these are individuals who are credible from the community and have many of the same experiences that people currently involved in violence are. If you go to the next slide. The changing behaviors, the preventing the future spread. And so this is the second component of. So the interrupters are kind of mediating conflict and keeping things cool. The second position of the outreach worker are individuals who can do some of the mediation work and have a similar profile as the interrupters, but their job is more long-term with the highest risk individuals and trying to help them, get connected with resources, but most importantly, is being kind of a new role model, doing some mentoring, and spending that long time really engaging individual, trying to change their behaviors associated with violence. And what we see in a lot of the areas we work in it can be very simple things that lead to multiple homicides. You know, it's not always about owing someone like $100,000 on some crazy drug trade deal gone wrong. I mean, oftentimes the violence might occur in some of the kind of illegal economy activities, but many times the spark of the violent event can be something very similar. But a lot of the people who've had multiple exposure to violence and kind of live in a community where what's taking place immediately go to responding with violence. And so really trying to work long-term with individuals to change their thinking and behaviors around the necessity to respond to whatever conflict it might be. You looked at me this way, or you're now dating someone I used to, or you owe me $20,000, is to not respond. Not my first response to be using violence. And so that's the second component of preventing future spread. We're really trying to work with the highest risk, those who are actively involved in shooting today and tomorrow, to change their thinking and behavior, and then provide whatever support is necessary. And, you know, each individual kind of has their own story and their own specific both needs, but also strengths. So, and then the third component, you can go to the next slide, is this norm change. And so the idea of really trying to have different events, shooting responses, midnight barbecues, but trying to really get the message out that no longer in this neighborhood, in this community, is violence acceptable. And this happens through sometimes really engaging the faith community. Sometimes there's marches, sometimes there's, you know, late night basketball activities. But for us, that alone is, if it's not connected to the really working with the highest risk in that area on their behavior change and then working on the interruption stuff, it sometimes can be hard to link to real change. And so we think this is very important, but it has to be kind of targeted and strategically linked to the ongoing interruption and outreach activities. So you can go to the next slide. This is just another example of an event when someone is shot, just, you know, responding, making a big deal about it. I mean, oftentimes in the communities that we're from, you know, if a 3-year-old gets killed, it's a big deal. But if a 22-year-old drug dealer gets killed, it's not seen as something that's, you know, that big a deal. And we really want to change that anyone being killed for any reason is not normal, not acceptable in our communities. Go to the next slide, please. And to that end too, with events, we develop public education campaigns that kind of flood the areas that we're working in. And it really is tailored to what the specific kind of community needs are. And we use a lot of social media now as this has changed, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, all of those things to promote kind of positive anti-violence messages. Go to the next slide, please. And again, I mean, we don't have a ton of time, but this being based on a public health approach, there are certain like management protocols that have to do with how do we deliver these services that are absolutely critical for this program to work. And after this, we're going to talk about some of the independent evaluations we had, but the critical thing about this approach is not necessarily just finding individuals to go on the street at night and to engage people. Like, that's a critical part of it. And I think it's great that the city of Minneapolis has done that. I think to think about this in terms of the long term and really being able to measure the impact is the importance of having the management infrastructure and having the data and having these kind of management protocols implemented to ensure that the interventions are both effective, addressing who we need to work with, and then really being able to measure its impact. And so this is just a picture of one of the sites. You know, we really think about things on a map. We block, you know, we really map out house by house, block by block, group by group, individual by individual, both in the community and people coming from the outside of it. Who do we need to engage? Who's at highest risk to be involved in violence? And how do we step in and intervene before that line is crossed, or once that line is crossed, to try and prevent further retaliation on it? And so this is a really critical aspect of, I think, that we'll be spending a lot of time with the Office of Violence Prevention, of just really sharing some best practices and trainings around these protocols of management and implementation, because this is the critical thing, the difference between cities and communities that do this program and see results and ones that don't. So we can go to the next slide. And just, you know, very quickly, I mean, from a health perspective or from a public health perspective, we really are kind of trying to re-understand and rethink about violence away from moralism, bad people and bad choices, and thinking about adverse circumstances, this idea of transmission, and having science kind of guide our way in terms of how we're thinking about it, our policies, and what pragmatic programs we're putting in place as part of our comprehensive strategy. So if you go to the next slide, this is just to give you a sense of where the program is: Canada, US, Mexico, kind of a lot in Latin American, Caribbean, some in Africa. We've done some stuff in Europe and some programs in the Middle East. And each time, in each city we work with, and each community we work with, it's really adapted locally. So we don't go and open up offices anywhere. It's really about engaging local partners, engaging local capacities, and providing some training, some support, so that local actors are the ones implementing this program. And this is a critical thing. So we're Cure Violence Global, but we really only have offices in a couple cities for our staff. We don't open up offices anywhere. It's really about working with existing infrastructures and existing groups. So the next slide, and then I will be done shortly. In terms of the independent evaluations, I just want to go over a couple highlights of this approach and some of the findings we've seen. So you can go to the next slide. The first evaluation that was done on some of our programming in Chicago by Northwestern University a while ago now looked at kind of this idea of cooling down hotspots, and looked at the concept of reducing the number of shootings per square mile. And so what we see is before and after the program. It used to be called Ceasefire in Chicago. This is just some results of that. So you can see it has a cooling down effect in terms of shootings per square mile. You can go to the next slide. And again, we saw this in Inglewood, which is the south side neighborhood of Chicago, where we're able to see a cooling down effect. And what you don't see in this is it's not just cooling it down here and then spreading it to another neighborhood. If you're really engaging those that are at highest risk to be involved in violence, it's not about pushing it, down the line a little bit. It's about really shifting the behavior so that you see this cooling down effect. The next slide, you can go to it. This idea, what we looked at here, shootings, hotspots, but I think an important thing they saw is this idea of reciprocal or retaliatory homicides. And so in many of the sites that they looked at, they were able to see a pretty good reduction in terms of reducing a retaliatory homicide. And, as we know, one event leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. So that's Chicago. If we go to the next slide, and all of these results are published in journals and are on our website, so you could look at them in more detail. But I want to just draw attention to a couple other points. What we saw in Baltimore by an evaluation done by Johns Hopkins, we were able to see reductions, between 33 and 47% in terms of some of the homicides that we're looking at. And I think one of the sites actually went more than a year without a homicide taking place in the community. And this was a public housing project that was really, unthought of before the program was implemented. You go to the next slide. There's an evaluation done by John Jay about the program in New York. And again, we see kind of similar numbers of reductions in terms of gun injuries and shooting victimization. So it ranges 15 to 63%. These are just looking at some of the areas that we're working in. If you go to the next slide, again, we start seeing kind of the reductions compared to comparison areas in both gun injuries and shooting victimizations. And again, all this is on the website, but I think there's a pretty strong body of evidence in terms of this approach being able to be helpful to a city as part of a broader strategy. One thing that came out in the John Jay evaluation that we don't always talk about, and it wasn't necessarily an aim of the project, was we saw that confidence in police tended to increase in the areas at a higher rate where the program existed than where it didn't exist. And that hasn't really been a stated objective of the program. I mean, I think we see ourselves as part of a comprehensive approach. And so law enforcement has their role, education has their role, economic stuff has their role. And what we really see the public health role, our part of the public health role, is this kind of intervening with the highest risk, both through interruption and outreach and community norm change activities. But what we saw in New York is by doing that, I think it allowed some more space for police to engage in a different way. And so we saw the confidence improving in police in the areas where we were working, although that wasn't our stated objective. Next slide, please. And there's been some evaluations of our programs in Trinidad, and actually one was just released about our program in Cali, Colombia. But again, we saw in East Port of Spain, which is a very rough part of Trinidad, you can go to the next slide, we saw similar things where we saw reductions of homicide, we saw reductions of people being admitted to the hospital, and we saw that we were able to implement the program in a country as different from the United States as Trinidad is. If you can go to the next slide, you know, you see this kind of immediate drop that happens once we start implementing. And if you go to the next area, next slide, compared to a synthetic control unit, you know, just because we weren't able to do a randomized control trial on this intervention, we saw that the areas we were working in saw a much greater reduction of homicides than other areas would have had. You go to the next slide. Like I said, many of the communities that we work in that do this program see multiple years without a killing. Some of the communities in New York went a year, one of them went 1,000 days without a homicide. We've seen that similarly in Baltimore and other cities. And if you think about that, really lessens this idea of exposure. And so if kids aren't seeing and having to walk over dead bodies on the way to school, they're not hearing the same level of gunshots, it really has an enormous impact in terms of a lot of other parts of the community, but as well as, you know, assisting in other parts of the interventions that are going on at a community level. Next slide, and then I will be done shortly. You know, this is something that The Economist over a decade ago thought would come to prominence. It's been featured in a number of films. This is the Institute of Medicine's kind of workshop summary about the contagion of violence. I think that's really important work in terms of the scientific literature about the contagious nature of violence. And there's been other things, you know, other books, et cetera, that have featured us. So anyway, thank you very much for having me. I apologize I had to go through that kind of quickly, but I know we were kind of at the end of our time. So thank you for listening to my presentation this afternoon.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. It's an honor to have you. I also just want to quick show off a little bit that I actually have this book on my desk and read it and refer to it frequently. So I appreciate that. And I often share Dr. Slutkin's Violence is a Contagion article as a way to be able to give folks a taste of the public health approach to public safety. So thank you for all your work with this and being a part of what we're looking to do here locally. So thank you. I do have a question or comment from Council President Bender.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks for this overview. I wondered if you could talk more about some of the operational details. So when you show the map of or the picture of the map and thinking about strategy, who's in the room, you know, what communication channels and partnerships are necessary. I think here we have some really great partnerships, and I think information sharing kind of waxes and wanes sometimes based on personal relationships. It'd be helpful for us to understand how we can maybe institutionalize or operationalize some of those information sharing and partnership pieces.
Sure. So, I mean, most of my answers are always like, it kind of depends on what city we're talking about, because, you know, individual cities have put this together in different ways. And so there's cities like New York, Baltimore, others that have like a Office of Violence Prevention that is kind of a main body of convening of kind of the institutional relationships. So in between like law enforcement, sometimes like the sheriff's office, if there's like a county jail, or so there can be like an institutional level of kind of information sharing and kind of coordination. At the community level, what tends to happen is there's a community-based partner that is selected to serve as like the implementing agency. And in their role, there's kind of a program manager whose role is to engage all other existing efforts, resources, et cetera, and sit on as many kind of committees and boards as possible, both locally and sometimes at a city level, so that we can understand both what's going on, what resources are available, and how our specific lane in terms of interruption and outreach and behavior change with the highest risk can feed into other efforts. And so that's a critical component, both at an institutional level, but then at a community level. And a big part of our kind of training for the day-to-day implementation is that's a critical piece, both at an institutional level and at a community level. And then that also then kind of frees up the interrupters and outreach workers to do their day-to-day activities, that they're not necessarily the main point of contact with every service provider, but there is someone who is doing that at a community level, that is sitting in the important like school council meetings, et cetera, to be able to share and understand what we're seeing or what other people are seeing, and seeing where the symmetry is and where the points of referral can be. And so we both have at a community level, and then there's also at an institutional level.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. I really appreciate the clear framework when it comes to thinking about the public health approach to public safety. And one of the things that I talk about a lot, but I feel like is not necessarily a part of the broader discourse related to public safety and particularly gun violence, is childhood trauma from witnessing violence. That exposure, like that in of itself is a form of transmission of violence, and trying to communicate that with folks and the urgency of that in of itself is an epidemic that feeds into others. And so I really appreciate you helping to pull some context and really naming that very clearly, that we cannot forget childhood trauma in the midst of everything that's happening. I actually just spoke to a middle school class yesterday about public safety and what are they experiencing, and I mean it's very illuminating. These were 11-year-olds, being able to hear their perspective and how they're impacted by what's happening out in the community, even what they're hearing. They don't even have to necessarily see it for it to be, for it to be transmitted in that way, and that trauma to impact them. So, really, I wish that there was a way for us to be able to more broadly talk about the public health approach to public safety in a way that folks can really hear it. I've been trying to share that because this is really brilliant, and it works. The evaluations show that it works, and so I'm grateful that we're bringing this work here into Minneapolis, that we're leveraging the amazing skills and assets that our community folks bring to the table to be able to do this work well locally, and excited to continue our partnership in really doing our best work here and saving some lives. So thank you again. Are there any questions or comments from my colleagues? Councilmember Fletcher.
I just want to join in really cheering on this framework. I think that it's an analysis that feels like it has a ton of potential. I think it's actually in some ways fortuitous that we had the presentation on lead abatement and lead poisoning in the same conversation, because I think in many ways, when we think about the violence that occurs, both in terms of the immediate tragedy of the violence and in terms of the sustaining trauma and sustaining effects that it has in transmission, I think it raises the stakes and I think really highlights how important it is when we are able to make some interventions. So I'm really appreciative of this work. I think it's something that we should be doubling down on as we think about our path forward as a city and how we address violence, both for today and for the long run. And so I appreciate the technical support and the really generative thinking. I think this is something that will help our city move forward. So I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing anybody else in queue to speak, so I just want to again say thank you for being here. Thank you for your patience. We're still working out these meetings. Public health and safety are both very big topics, and particularly given the fact that we are in a public health crisis and a public safety crisis right now. So thank you for your patience as we're hammering it out and sticking around for this, working with us. With that, thank you again. I will direct the clerk to file both of these presentations related to community safety and the evidence-based violence interventions. With that, we have no further business before us. Thank you to all of the staff of the reporting departments for all of their hard work, not only those who presented or had items on the agenda today, but all of those who serve our city with their whole heart and all of their brilliance. We are lucky to have them as employees of the city of Minneapolis. With that, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.